Well,
That
Goethe was an example of a person who was a reactionary
yes,
in this case, who believed there was a profound wisdom in nature.
yes.
But we're smarter. We have human reason. We've realised that nature is empty. It needs our input.
That's what we
It
think.
cannot exist by itself.
That's right. That's what we think.
It's a blind, dumb animal wandering around, smashing into things.
Yes, unlike us, who are so very, very wise. Thank God we're here to to give the empty cosmos the proper meaning through our elections and market
Human
activity.
reason, the greatest force in the entire cosmos.
Yeah.
I wonder how they arrive at those conclusions.
Yeah. Well, they're not conclusions, they're a priori. That's where we begin. Therefore, they don't need to be examined, and we can just trust that it must be true.
They're
Kenneth
not
Smith spends a lot of
axioms.
time examining this issue of kind of the difference between a priori thoughts and a posteriori thoughts. That is to say, what did we let nature teach us? And what did we decide beforehand and are careful never to question? And this is sort of where the dividing line between, noetic and gnosic activities happens, right? If we're letting nature teach us, if we're letting experience be our teacher, then there's gnosis going on, and nature has a chance to knock some sense into our heads. But if we rely on a priori propositions and logical deductions from those propositions, then we're dealing with noesis, and we have insulated ourselves from nature, and we're careful not to learn anything from reality or experience. It keeps us safe within our ideologies, right? It's a good point you raise.
Well, there's the free holies, the free sacreds. I haven't found a proper name for the category. But within that category, you have theism, you have naturalism, and you have humanism. They're all points of a type of worship.
Yes.
There could be more. It's not actually mine. These three have been determined by others. And of course, we had theism, the God that was sort of above nature. Then we have the worship of nature, the deep piety and deep respect for the genius within nature.
Yes.
But that's dismissed. We've discovered nature is stupid. And then we have humanism, where humanism reflects purely upon what is within the human as being it. Not that probably doesn't have its positives, but human reason has been promoted to the great God of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see how much of an effect the larger context has upon our interpretation of core ideas. Because there were certainly ancient humanists, but an ancient humanist is someone who thinks nature is on top, and then come the gods, and then come people. And therefore, our reason is an obligation that we have to bring to the party, to help us understand our experience. It's an entirely different perspective if we are moderns. And so during the medieval epoch, we toppled nature as a source of meaning. And during the modern epoch, we then topple God. And now we think that reason doesn't need a context. Anything that we vote must be the truth. We get together in a group and we hold an election, and voila, the sky is now orange because we said so. This is something that Hannah Arendt talks about in essay 7 of Between Past and Future, her essay on truth and politics, when she says, it is one of the things that's the hardest for moderns is to accept that things can be true, even if not a single person would vote to say that it's true. That nature has this rudeness, that it's not willing to take into account majority opinion. And part of, that's the perspective that she takes in talking about it. But what she's uncovering is the extent to which noesis has deified itself, and thinking that if we decide something, it must ipso facto be true because we decided it. And how dare ugly facts intrude and tell us that, that we're wrong. They don't have the right to do that. So after all, we won the election, so therefore we're right. There's this kind of insular, circular quality to modern reasoning that causes it to really get confused about what's real and what's not real. So we'll why don't we we've got some questions lined up. Why don't we work our way through them here? We'll start with Donald. He's had his hand up, and then we'll do Rama after that. So go ahead, Donald. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, if Stephen does not want to accept the rationality and ensuing wisdom offered to him by modernity, then I suggest he just wander in the dark, and modernity should withdraw its offer.
Right. This is modernity's offer. Precisely. It's this or nothing. Yeah.
Good to hear from you, Stephen.
I've been deeply suspicious of this thing, which looks very much like modernity from a very early age.
Yes.
There's something from a very early age that just didn't. Something's not matching up here. Has always been my feeling. On the other hand, I see the rest are positively racing with it. They've got the ball. They're running for the line, and nothing else matters.
Yep. Yeah, it helps if one has early life experiences that cause one to question what nobody else questions. If you don't have any life experiences like that, it's sort of hard to catch the philosophy bug. But it's, if you've had some disruptions, if you've been an outsider, if you've stumbled over your own feet enough, then it can cause you to start to ask the questions that make you more philosophical. There's a certain
yes.
certain amount of disappointment and frustration is required to light the candle.
Think meta. I agree.
Anyway, you had a question, Rama. You said you were asking whether we mean objective truth or subjective truth.
Correct. So my point of view is we do create truth, but as a community, we create truth, and then there are objective truths that, even if community agrees or not, do not change. I also agree that it is not a clear demarcation, that the borders are quite blurry between what is subjective and what is objective truth. But for within the context that we define, we can define something as subjective and something else as objective. And the subjective truth is what needs a majority approval or a common denominator. The objective truths are very, very hard to change.
Thank you, Rama. Yeah, let me take a step back and sort of characterize the series that we're doing so that you can kind of get some context for this. That might help.
Yeah.
So this seminar is part of a series about the writings of philosopher Kenneth Smith. And this particular arc, which we've been doing for just over a year, is called Millennia and Microcosm. It's a book forthcoming from philosopher Kenneth Smith. He wrote all the installments of it between 1998 and 2001 as a column in the back of the Comics Journal, of all places. That was the column was called End Times, but Millennia and Microcosm is his preferred title. What this work is it has the following idea. It's drawing off of the existentialist tradition of history, and it's arguing that during each major epoch of history, what defines that epoch is that all the different people in all the different cultures tend to interpret the world with certain kinds of shared assumptions about what's meaningful and what's not, what's true and what's not, and what's right and what's wrong. And these assumptions largely are consistent even across cultures that are seemingly very different from each other. It's the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age, if you will, to use Hegel's terminology. And that the differences are not small or subtle, but are huge and enormous differences in interpretation. And that they are not a matter of opinion, but are something that you can study and examine and discover present within that history. If you can look at it from outside, and this is where the problem comes, if you can look at each epoch from outside the distorting lens of your own epoch's interpretation of reality. So our problem is, if we try to understand medievals, we don't understand medievals as they actually are. We understand them as a modern would caricature or characterize a medieval, and it prevents us from really getting inside the medieval mindset. We do the same thing if we look back at the ancients. We don't look at them as they actually were. We look at them as a modern would look at them, which is a caricature again of who they are. So what this book is about is an exercise in trying to teach us what these different epochs are like, what their worldviews are like, completely separate from the way that moderns might prefer to look at them. We look at the ancient epoch, we look at the medieval epoch, and then having gone through the experience of getting outside of the modern mindset, we then come back to the modern mindset for the end of the book to say, now, what does a modern look like to everybody but a modern? What does everybody else think we look like? That is, who are we not as we wish we were or as we flatter ourselves to be, but who are we actually? It's a really interesting exercise he's doing in this book. So the questions that you're asking, what's objective truth, what's subjective truth, and which one we mean, within the framework of this book, we have to add another factor to your question, and that is, what do these things mean to an ancient? What do they mean to a medieval? And what do they mean to a modern? We get three different answers. It's interesting. It's interesting. So that's
I love this.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. And the little shorthand I'll paste into the chat is that there are three sources of meaning that you can use as a simple metric to get started thinking about these epochs. And the three sources of meaning, which I'll type in here, are nature, God, and man, right? And by God, we mean the gods, the God singular, the God plural, the whole area of the divine or the sacred is one zone. Nature, that is what is actually in the cosmos, is another zone. And man, not meaning gendered, but meaning Homo sapiens and humanity. What do we think? And what is in a third zone. So to be an ancient is to organize them in the order nature, then the gods, then man. That is to say, to an ancient, this is the chapter we're in, chapter 4, we're studying ancient civilization and their epoch's worldview. They believed that nature was preeminent over the gods. They believed that the gods did not in fact create nature, but that nature was here first, and that the gods are expressions of nature, they're aspects of nature. They're here to remind us of parts of nature. Yeah, kitty cat. And then, but that the gods are subject to nature, right? Zeus can't violate nature. He's just really good at the part of nature that he represents, better than a person could ever be. And then humanity occupies the bottom tier, right? So if we disagree with nature, for example, gravity is in nature and it's pulling us down, and we say, well, I wish I could just float up to that cloud. Well, we don't, despite the fact that we will it. Even if we have an election and say, let's all vote, and at the end of this vote, I will be on the cloud, and the vote succeeds, and we're still not on the cloud, we're still standing on the ground. And that's because we're subject to nature under the ancient worldview. That's what the ancients believed. And the ancients believed the same was true of the gods. They were also subject to nature. Behind the Olympian gods we know, like Zeus and Athena and Ares, there were the fates. And behind, that measured the thread of life, and cut it and determine how long everybody would live and what their course would be, and wove them into the fabric of time. And behind the fates, they believed in this even older, darker divinity called Ananke, or necessity, who is sort of a reflection of the way that nature has its lawfulness and its rules that it's not willing to violate even for the gods. You see this in Norse mythology, that why is Odin so wise? Well, it's not his own inherent wisdom. He had to go sipping from the right well. He had to get access to the deeper wisdom of nature. And it's his access to that, to nature's wisdom, that makes him wise. Same for Zeus, who listens to the fates and listens to Ananke. So in this hierarchy, when push comes to shove, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And that means, for humanity, the ancients believed you had an obligation to study nature and to study the gods, and then try to harmonize your life with what you learned. Now, the medieval epoch was a revolution against the ancient epoch. we're going to do a little 5-minute characterization of the whole book here. So it's God, then man, then nature, right? So one of the differences is that where the ancients believed that nature creates the gods, the medievals believed that God created nature. It says so right at the beginning of Genesis, right? And it's reiterated all over. God the creator, right? Creator of all things. He created the universe from nothing. He's so powerful, he didn't need raw materials. He could just will it into existence through the power of his astonishing rationality and will and spirit. So God is now the highest. And then there is nature, but as said in, I think it's Genesis 2, that man is appointed as a custodian over nature, and that man is not to see nature as a source of meaning. Only God is the source of meaning. God has a monopoly on meaning because his will determines everything. And therefore, in some sense, nature is meaningless, right? If we're really trying to understand what we should do, we should just focus everything on God. And man only has meaning to the extent to which God has given us the gift of grace. And grace is this ineffable, insubstantial but all important connection to God. It's the spark of the divine within each of us that allows us to borrow meaningfulness from God. It's God's intention and God's gift to us. So what we have here is meaning, which used to be under the ancient order distributed 3 ways among nature, gods, and man, with priorities among them. In the medieval worldview, all meaning has been pulled into God. Nature has been left meaningless, and man has been left almost meaningless except for the gift of grace and man's ability to attend to God and do what God wants. So obviously this means how you answer questions of right and wrong, true or false, what's objective or subjective, really any philosophical level question has an entirely different set of answers if these are the sources of meaning, the medieval sources rather than the ancient sources. Under modernity was a revolution against the medieval epoch, and it has man, then nature, then God. That is to say, modernity overthrew God as the preeminent source of meaning. This is something that Nietzsche criticizes when he says God is dead. He's not saying, hooray, God is dead and I hate God and I'm an atheist. He was nothing like that. What he's doing is saying moderns are hypocrites who claim to be religious while actually having dethroned God and usurped his position for themselves. So now we decide in legislative assemblies or courts of law or marketplaces what we think is true or false, what we think is right or wrong. And those decisions, when you look at the 500 years of modern history, don't pay any particular reverence to God. God becomes a talking point, right, or a brand, rather than an all-important source of meaning the way he was in the medieval epoch. The kind of thing you see where Joan of Arc, an illiterate peasant, is able to organize an entire nation to rise up and fight a war against the English to drive them out. This happens because of people's agreements that God is more important than anything else. She doesn't have to be educated. She doesn't have to have a vote in an assembly. She doesn't have to have nobility. She just has to hear God and be a channel for God, and that's good enough, for hundreds of thousands of people to collect together and follow her. This is a medieval kind of behavior. But in the modern world, we have wannabe Joans of Arc on every corner, holding up signs and saying the end is not, and nobody cares. It has literally no influence. In the modern epoch, you can go to church and have God be important to you personally, and you can be active in your communities, and your church can have, great impacts and all that. But if you look at the structure of the law, if you look at the constitutions of nations, if you look at the way that the marketplace works and what money respects, you don't find God anywhere other than "In God We Trust" being printed on the money. So we have overthrown God as a source of meaning, and we've replaced it with humanity as the only source of meaning. The reasons for this, the corruption in the late medieval era, the selling of indulgences, all those things that led people to overthrow the church as the source of meaning, that's a whole thing we'll get into later. But the result is that the hierarchy for moderns is very different from the hierarchy for medievals or for ancients. We put man on top. That is to say, We will solve our own problems. We will decide for ourselves what is right or wrong. We will use science and math and logic to decide what is true. We won't be constrained by tradition. We won't be constrained by religion. We won't be constrained by our impressions of what nature tells us must be so. Naturally, we will, vote, and we'll buy, and we'll do these things that are human things, and that will determine truth and right or wrong, and so forth. So these three configurations of these three sources of meaning give us our epochs: the ancient, the medieval, and the modern that he's working with in this book. This is drawing off of, Hegel and Hannah Arendt and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and very, very, very old traditions of existentialist philosophy. And what he's trying to do in this book is say, well, let's go beyond the simple caricature of these three sources of meaning and say, what exactly do they mean? When you put them together, what do you get in these worldviews that's fundamentally different from what you get in another worldview, right? So we're in section E. Chapter 4 is going to try to do the ancient civilization, the ancient epoch, in a single chapter. And it's made up of 8 lettered sections. We've made it through A, B, C, and D so far. We're now halfway through section E, daimon and eudaimonia. And each of these is exploring some aspect of the implications of what happens when your source of meaning is first nature, and then the gods, and then man. And I think everybody who's been on the call for all these weeks would agree, there's some enormous implications. There are ways in which the ancients understand human beings and nature and the gods and right and wrong really differently than the way we do. And we'll explore some of that during this call, but that's the background. The link at the top, which I guess I will put again, just in case anybody missed it, right here, that's the link to chapter 4 that we're going through. And you can follow that link and scroll down to section E to see where we are. If you want to play catch up and see where we are, you can just scroll back to the earlier sections, A, B, C, and D, and see something about them. But we spent a year so far going through chapters 1, 2, and 3 and the first half of chapter 4. Because we're really, and this is the last thing I'll say before I call on the patiently waiting people. If you're new to these calls, Kenneth Smith has a very dense approach to language. He's not writing in a way that's designed to be read quickly. He wants you to take your time with the sentences and unpack them. And part of the reason is that a lot of what he says is pointing at other philosophers, other writers, artists, stages of history. He's trying to draw whole stretches of the past conversation in philosophy into each sentence. He writes very carefully and very deliberately. And so the result is it takes some unpacking to figure out what he's saying. He's packed a lot in there, and if you unpack it, you discover a lot of material in there. And that's what we're doing. That's how we could spend an entire year and only be halfway through chapter 4 so far. It's going to be 20 some odd chapters, so we're going to be at this for a while. But it's worthwhile because it's also like a quick education in the entire history of philosophy, because he keeps referencing other philosophers and what they said. All right, with that as our background, I'm going to dive in and call on Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it's interesting how you set up that triangle. Because the triangle by its very nature is sort of, let's not call it unstable fluxes in terms of movement. And I'm thinking really back to Egypt in a funny way. What it says to me in the Egyptian mythology is, you could say, humanity's stupid pet trick, or stupid human trick. The battle between, the thing is, human beings, its stupid pet trick is the ability to create civilizations, create structures, and then from that, build up a civilization, which nature does not have. Natures have groups, but they do not have civilization. And the relationship between Seth and Osiris was that Osiris was a representation of nature, but Seth was the representation of civilization, of measurements, of computation, of measuring and building things. And so Seth at first certainly won, dissected Osiris, dissected nature, and cast Osiris into being the god of the underworld. This is the reason why the Egyptians are so concerned with death, because that's a reality of what, in a sense, nature has in store for you. You will die, and you will be judged, and you will go to the underworld. And that's a significant part. Now, the third figure enters, which is that Osiris, therefore, was unable to battle Seth, but Osiris had a son. The son was Horus, and that created this sort of already a triangle relationship in the flux. And what happened is that it moves to Greece in a funny way. I'm going to make a transmutation there. And I once again, I got this from Heidegger, that the paradigm of Greek art was the temple. The temple was where the divine laws, God, you would say, was the third part that allowed for the relationship between, you could say, Osiris and Seth. And so, in the sense, a temple was really kind of Horus, in which they sort of like lived together. But more and more, I think of it as not so much a kind of, like I said, a champagne gathering between God and man, between Osiris and Seth, but was in fact a conference negotiation table, a conference room, where man could negotiate in his a need for civilization, need for culture, and Osiris, the need to sustain nature. Okay, so that, and I'll bring that in. And I think last time I brought up the whole thing about the synthesis between Athens and Jerusalem. When you talk about that synthesis, it's very interesting, because it revealed a very interesting moment when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, and he received the holy word from God, the laws, right? But when he came back, he saw that the Hebrews were in disarray. They were worshiping all sorts of stuff, golden calves and all that stuff. But he brought down the laws, which in a sense was, in this way of speaking, Osiris's law about the judgment. And Moses got so angry, by the way, as a man that got so angry at them not obeying, him by saying, don't misbehave when I go see the Lord, that he threw down the 10 Commandments and he fractured the laws of God. It was that fracture that allowed for, in a sense, mankind to enter into the temple and renegotiate. What does this mean between here and here? Because there's a crack. We can't tell. We have to interpret. So that's Heidegger's hermeneutic circle. We're born into a situation and you interpret. And there's a deep, long tradition of the Jewish culture to, in a sense, through the Talmud, for the scholars to constantly reinterpret the law, argue among themselves, and essentially argue with God.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell does this mean? Don't eat pork. I mean, it says so, but what does it mean? In a funny way, that itself is a dialectic. Because you're not supposed to argue with God.
Right.
But you have to protect your civilization.
Mm-hmm.
That's all there is to it. I mean, that, once again, that's our stupid human trick.
Culture, man.
Our culture. right? You can't just like, like let that being blown up, Mount Vesuvius, and that's it. You're dead and buried. And so I think what happened was that when the Christian took over it, they changed the temple into a cathedral, in which is no longer a negotiation table. It was just a place where you receive the one directional order. In other words, the unbroken tablet of Moses.
Yes.
And people realize that no, this is not good for civilization. We have to rebel against that. And that's where we are now. And the funny thing is, I just brought in a slightly different. I had one meeting with this group about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is interesting. The uncertainty principle may be the renegotiation table, right? My thought is it the uncertainty principle in which the human argument is wrong? Nature is actually order, like God says, and we are just so removed from it that we're not certain what the hell is going on. Because the best thing we got is mathematics, right? And it doesn't tell us exactly what it is. It's supposed to. Or is it more? This is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Or is it more like Niels Bohr? It's a principle of uncertainty. That nature itself, at the very, very fundamental level, is indeterminacy. So maybe in some way, there is not a match between the human laws, which is logic, mathematics, and nature's laws, which is uncertain. And so maybe there always was this sort of, fracture unrelatedness on some deep level, that in one sense, you could say that the human beings were correct, mathematics are correct, because if it's indeterminacy principle, you are certain that it's undetermined.
Right.
Right. You are now certain. You actually got it right. Right. It's just that the mathematics, in some ways, that we constructed is sort of wrong. I mean, it's like that reductive mathematics is wrong. And its very nature, our uncertainty is based on the fact that our logic is wrong. There is something fundamental about nature itself on a very deep level that's indeterminate. And so you have to deal with this indeterminacy in relationship to that. And once again, it opens up the Fluxus temple of renegotiation. This is my thought now. Of course, I'm not certain about the last argument, because we're not certain about, quantum mechanics.
Sure.
We're thinking about this, and we're still undecided whether there's a principle of indeterminacy or principle of uncertainty.
It's part of a larger group of principles that have to do with the relationship between the human mind and reality. I mean, you're onto something here for sure. I think Kenneth Smith would say, and it's true to the ancients as well. They accept this idea that there is an enormous challenge for people to try to understand things, because the nature is the realm of the infinite, of many infinities at the same time, and even the gods are the realms of infinity. But the mortal is finite. We only have so much time to live. We can only think about so many things at a time. We can only remember so many things.
Well,
we only take so many actions.
Well, it's interesting when you go back to the Hebrew Bible about the creation myth. Of course, it's a myth, so we can't take this as the gospel of truth, although the gospel has its own meaning. It's like, in the beginning, God existed with this amorphous stuff, right? which means the nature and actually space, because he floated above all this amorphous stuff. So stuff existed and space existed because he was above it, right? He was floating above it. And he saw this amorphous stuff and he divided it between light and darkness. There was ambiguity before he divided it.
Mm-hmm.
He separated, and he then, that's a funny thing about God. There's something in a way above God. Which is a funny kind of learning. I mean, I think God is also learning, because when he separated, he saw that light was good. He didn't know that before. I mean, it was just this amorphous stuff. That's what he realized there was relationship between good and bad. I'm not sure if he realized good and evil yet at that point. It was good. Let's not forget about, but he didn't say that the darkness was bad, right? He actually said, no, that's day and night, right? And to prove that, he says there's morning and evening.
Right.
So it's not like it's just a pure dialectic. There's a dialectic and there's a revolving relationship. So God himself learned something. He said, oh my goodness, that's good. I mean, he didn't go that I'll just make light, like let it be light. That's it, that's light. And he made it out of nothing, and it all came from him. He actually had to work with this stuff. And he says, oh, yeah, that's good. That seems like what an artist does in terms of creating things, You don't start out with, well, maybe conceptual art does, I don't know. You don't create something out of nothing. There's the clay, and you work with it, and that's good. I like that. Oh, maybe that's not so good. You don't like it. But in some sense, you learn like, oh yeah, I could do even better, make something else. So I think God was a creator in relationship to the stuff that was already there. That's it, So I'll leave it there. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Phil. So yeah, it gives us a pretty good, for those who weren't here last week, that gives us a pretty good catch up with some of the main themes that we were talking about last week. Stephen, why don't I call on you too, and then we'll go to the text. So go ahead.
Well, about 30 years ago, I spent some time working on philosophical ideas, trying to study some of the textbooks on philosophy, referring prior to the internet to the grand encyclopedia, multi-volume encyclopedia of philosophy, which I thought was a treasure trove back then. And what I became convinced of is what's called religion and science are polaric opposites. They represent two different methods we use to obtain knowledge. Now, religion is always cast as being something that's theistic, but you can have atheistic religions. It's a practice. And what I'd notice about science is, all right, you have a phenomenon, and science's immediate approach is to come up with a proposition about that phenomenon. It's immediately to impose an idea on that and then test out the idea. You take a cat, you cut it to pieces. So far, they haven't been able to put one back together, but it's a bit like the movie The Fly, which has the horrors of the mad scientist who puts his cat in the matter transmission. And as a kid, that was a horrifying moment when I watched. Now, religion doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a God, but it's the opposite of science. It involves practices which we'd call mystical, transcendental. They claim if you get to the third level, the occult, you'll get messages from beyond normal understanding. Some people see gods. Other people hear the pot talking to them at this level. But the initial phase, that mystical phase, compared to the voluntaristic phase of science. So you have that initial religious phase of mysticism, it's the opposite to science. You don't impose your view on things. You quiet yourself and listen very carefully. These seem to be the two divergent methods. And for example, some native man who's developed a high degree of skill in tracking animals doesn't always use the analytical to make a determination. They've developed a very high ability of listening to the signs. So these are actually, these are two mental processes which are opposites, which we call religion or mysticism and science. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, this alludes back to this other theme that runs throughout this book, which is drawing off the existentialist tradition of modeling the human mind and its activities. And this is kind of what this is related to what Rama's been asking about. So the term gnosis, Kenneth Smith uses the term gnosis a lot for the experiential mental faculty, which I'll just type in here real quick. And the experiential mental faculty in its naive form is what an infant is born into, where they are paying attention to what they feel, what they sense outside themselves and what they sense inside themselves. They don't have much, a newborn infant doesn't have much of an identity apart from their responses to what they're sensing. Because they're so 100% immersed within the experience of their life, it's almost like they're synonymous with the experience of their life. Now, that's very different from the adult experience of life, because as Hegel says, although gnosis is at first quite interesting, it's all encompassing. To say it's quite interesting is a gross understatement. It's all encompassing. It's possessing, if you will. It also has its dissatisfactions, like we don't like being hungry, we don't like being thirsty, and we start to want to intervene in our experiences. We start to have a negation, says Hegel, of our experiences, where we say we don't want to be synonymous with this experience. We want to be able to escape bad experiences. We want to be able to predict them and head them off so that we don't have to even have them in the first place. And what we're developing through that process of negation is noesis, the other faculty, which is sort of a willful, what do I want to say, anticipatory, predicting, and changing faculty, right? This is a faculty that's concerned with, what if things didn't have to be the way that they are? What if I could take a drink of water before I was dying of thirst? what if I could eat a sandwich instead of lying on the floor bemoaning my terrible hunger pangs? What if I could intervene in my life? And to develop that willfulness requires an ability to predict the future, to discover patterns. It's a pattern making faculty, but it's the combination of pattern making and then new pattern imposing. Right, the ability to sense the pattern of things, to abstract from the full experience of things, to sense their pattern, and to be able to juxtapose an alternative pattern that we prefer, and come up with the actions that we can take to impose our preferred pattern over the world. It's noesis is an abstracting faculty. That is to say, it doesn't take the full experience of life. It's looking for the patterns and suppressing the parts that aren't relevant to the patterns in order to figure out its planning. Whereas gnosis is a whole forming, immersive faculty of the mind. Now, Hegel and the others in this existentialist tradition say we have both of these faculties within us. I mean, genetically, biologically, this is part of Homo sapiens' approach to the world, that we begin almost entirely in gnosis, and then through successive negations and dissatisfactions, we gradually separate ourselves and abstract ourselves from that immersive infantile experience and start to develop a self that's separate from the world, a self that wants some things and doesn't want other things, that remembers some things and doesn't remember other things, that plans for some things and not for others, and tries to work out how to shift its experience into the direction that it prefers. And so there's a dialectical struggle.
What Freud would call the anal stage.
Yeah, right. The controlling, yes, that's right. So, you know, what Hegel says, and this is, I guess, mainly for Rama and Marilyn, but it's a review for others, is that the, you know, naive gnosis, the full or nearly full gnosis, or at least a mode of life in which gnosis is the primary way of dealing with the world, is what he calls begriff. A begriff, you know, the begriff approach to the world is focused on sensation. It's focused on feelings. It's focused on memories. It's very concrete. It's parochial, and it's experiential, and there's a, as Kenneth Smith says, there's a pathos to it. You're to experience the world, to pay attention to it, you're sort of suffering the world rather than willing and acting upon it. It's happening to you. You're the object rather than the subject. The world is the subject and you're the object in begriff. For those who develop a more noetic direction and start to center on noesis instead of on gnosis, you know, he calls that Verstand. And that's a naive form of noesis. And in this naive form of noesis, we reject the inadequacies of the begriff lifestyle and start to identify as intellectuals and rational people, as intelligent people. We focus on cogito ergo sum is a classic summation of the value system. He thinks he's saying something ontologically true, but he's actually making a value proposition when he says cogito ergo sum. He identifies himself with his thinking, right? That's a noetic, that's a Verstand thing to do, to think that your noesis is who you are. And all those messy feelings, that's just the muck that you've crawled out of to become this high enlightened intellectual, right? It's Descartes. I'm looking at you, man. So these are two of the three faculties, and Hegel says that both of them are traps. Both of them are limited. Each of them is so focused on its own strengths and the other one's weaknesses that they create half-witted approaches to life. You're either, live as though this is your last day, focus on what you feel, give me your immediate impression kind of person, or you're a, planning, thinking, analyzing, disconnected from life person at the extremes. And it's hard to be in the middle because these two faculties repel each other. Their approaches to life are precisely the opposite. You can't do Verstand if you are attending to everything that's happening around you, because there's an infinite number of things happening around you and it's overwhelming. To do Verstand, you have to be able to suppress most of reality and push it into the blurry background and just focus on the small number of things that your theory or your plan or what have you considers to be important.
Okay,
right?
One faculty is the one which sees a line and sends you 20 feet up a tree, yes, beyond any conceived ability.
Yes, that's right. I mean, if you're in begriff, you're constantly running up trees because you're constantly seeing lions, and part of what makes Verstand work is that you can say, I'm not going to pay attention to that lion or that lion or that lion because, today I want to build a house and I need wood and I need saws, and lions are irrelevant to all that. So I'm just not going to look at the lions. I'm only going to look at the wood and the saws and my little diagram and plans.
Look, I'll open encyclopedia and look up lion, have a very long thought. Yes, lions. Yes,
exactly. So Hegel says that they're both traps and that there is a third faculty of the mind that adult Homo sapiens are supposed to develop into. And Kenneth Smith says this more clearly than Hegel does, but Hegel says it. And that faculty is Vernunft, which is the mature adult mental faculty. It combines gnosis and noesis without compromising either one. And this is only possible if you don't let yourself stay immersed, right? Begriff is immersed in gnosis and Verstand is immersed in noesis. That is, you're either living in the world of feeling and experience, or you're living in the world of theory and ideas. But in either case, you're immersed. And that immersion is part of what repels the other faculty and prevents you from using it effectively. The more noetic you are, the less effective you are at gnosis. The more gnosic you are, the less effective you are at noesis. They push each other away. Each one uses exactly the opposite things as the parts of reality that it pays attention to. Gnosis ignores the pattern for the details. And noesis, ignores the details for the sake of the pattern. And because the human mind is finite, you can't have all of the infinity of reality in your head at once. There's no room. You have to suppress almost everything to focus on the small number of things that'll fit inside a human skull. So this is why the two tend to repel each other and become trapped. So he says the trick to Vernunft is that you neither identify with your experiences, nor do you identify with your ideas, but instead you identify with something else that allows you to hold the addictive quality of your feelings and experiences at bay, and allows you to hold the addictive quality of your ideas and ideologies at bay, and to engage with them without being sucked into them. And it's a struggle. Unlike the other two, which are it's comfortable to be a Begriff person. It's comfortable to be a Verstand person. It feels complete. It's very uncomfortable to be a Vernunft person. You're denying yourself that comfort in order to keep from being sucked into the addictive qualities of either one of them. And so it can be developed, but it's a struggle. And part of how Kenneth Smith characterizes the modern epoch is, this is the first epoch in which, to the greatest extent possible, we have tried to suppress the development of Vernunft in any human being. All people are required to be either Verstand people or Begriff people. They're required to either be the matter of the marketplace, producers and consumers and so on, or they're required to be the shapers of the marketplace, the big idea people, the planning people. But we have no room for people who want to, upset the cart. Modernity is focused on the stability of its economic relations. And in order to pull that off, we just have to do away with the adult mental faculty altogether. We have to create a flatland in which people are trapped in one of two addictions. And those two addictions are organized into sort of what we might call the psychological equivalent of mutually assured destruction, where we pursue a really unhealthy thing in the theory that the two will balance off each other and somehow it'll all work out. So this is, drawing off of what Stephen said and what Phil said and some of the things Rama talked about. This is some of the background that Kenneth Smith is building off of in this book, is this existentialist idea of how the human mind is structured and how it interprets things. So as a result, some of the complexity of answering questions like objective versus subjective is, it's not just which epoch are you living in that affects how you answer this question, but also, are you a Begriff person? Are you a Verstand person? Are you a Vernunft person? The truth looks different to all three of them. And it looks different for all three of them in each of the three different epochs. So there's you can imagine a grid of possibilities. And where it really gets interesting, to dilate out of the finite of any kind of system into the infinite of reality, is that these epochs only account for the last few thousand years of history. And people have been around like 400,000, 200,000, 400,000 years. We don't know what people used to do before that. We don't know what all these other modes of civilization were, how people conceived of the world. The whole point of this book is not to say this is the sum total of human possibilities. It's to say, here is an exercise in freeing ourselves from thinking that the last 500 years of interpretation are true or are the only interpretation possible, and to shift into a mode where we can understand that part of what makes us human beings is the way in which we clothe ourselves in these worldviews, so that we can learn to take the clothes back off and put on something different from one day to the next, to look at the world from different angles. All right, so with that as the background, why don't we dive into the text? We're about an hour into our 3-hour session, and as typical, we are just beginning to start the first sentence of actual text. But it takes a while to ramp up to this, right? There's a lot of, it's interesting stuff. There's a lot of background. So we are starting the fourth paragraph of section E, daimon and eudaimonia. Daimon and eudaimonia is talking about free will and determinism. It's talking about the nature of character and how it affects the fate of human beings and what we do. And we did the introductions on this in the last couple of weeks. And now we're halfway through, and Kenneth is starting to build the implications and pull it together towards the conclusion of section E. We do not deserve ultimately to be made as we are, but by the same token, we have no rational grounds for complaint. So this is the natural, remember, this is the ancient worldview we're talking about, not the medieval worldview or the modern worldview. What does an ancient think? An ancient thinks we are the way we are naturally, not because God made a judgment about right and wrong and created us within that framework, and not because we have voted and decided, not because we ratified the decision to be this way. Our own human choice was not involved in this, and from an ancient perspective. And from an ancient perspective, there wasn't a moral reason why we were made this way. You know, we're not being rewarded or punished. This is just naturally how we are. And as we saw in section A, nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth, you know, nature is the authority on what's true and what's not true. Things that actually are found in nature are genuinely true, whether we like it or not. So this is how we are. The things that we've talked about last week in section E. There's stuff about our daimon, about our character, the way that it rides us, the way that our decisions, our reason, everything about our thinking is strongly influenced by this part of ourselves that we don't think about and don't notice. This is just the way we are. We're just, this is who we are as an animal. Life is under no intrinsic obligation to satisfy our whimsical demands. And this clause, right, this is a refutation of the modern perspective. The modern perspective is the only truth is political truth. We get together, we vote on what's true, and that makes it true. That ratification. He's saying, no, life doesn't care. Life doesn't care about our vote. We are how we are. That's just the way things are. And for that matter, we have in abstracto no substantial wisdom that would entitle us to know how we ought to have been designed. This, again, is a refutation of modernity. He's trying to pry loose our understanding of the human condition from the modernist ideologies, right? The modernist ideology is that we choose everything, we decide everything, including we decide what's right and wrong, we decide what's wise, we plan, and that's how the modern world works, right? Nothing needs to be respected. We can intervene wherever we want to and shape things to our will. And he's saying here, well, that's not the ancient perspective. The ancient perspective is we didn't design ourselves, and thank God we didn't, because if we had, there's no reason to believe that Homo sapiens has the wisdom required to design an effective Homo sapiens, right? We don't know what's healthy for us. So if we were trying to design a human psychology, we would botch the job. We're lucky that we evolved, that nature had millions, billions of years to do trial and error to come up with a species that more or less works, because that has a kind of deep natural wisdom to it that we lack as individual people. Or, even though as moderns, we might rebel against the idea of being subject to nature's choices for us, our own choices would have been far worse. We don't know enough. We're too finite. We're too limited. Our understanding of what makes a species work is just, we're like, biology is such a young science for us. Psychology is even younger. We really don't know what we're doing when it comes to trying to figure out how would you make a viable animal that could thrive in the world and be healthy. If we had 100 people to sit down and design 100 animals from scratch and say, well, this is going to be Homo sapiens, the odds are all 100 of them would fail relatively quickly. We can write a program. You see this in computer programming. Writing a software program is a much, much, much simpler task than designing a person. I mean, like by many scales of magnitude. And yet, almost all software we write has bugs in it. Right? I speak as someone who's been doing this for coming on 40 years now, right? I'm really good at writing, after 40 years, I'm really good at writing software in my chosen domain. And yet, my software has bugs in it, and so does everybody else's. So imagine that instead of just trying to write, a subroutine that was going to calculate the mean, the median, and the mode, which I just debugged this morning. I was embarrassed to discover I had bugs in there dating from a year ago. Imagine I'm trying to design a human psychology. How many bugs would that have in it? I mean, I would blow it, right? And so the ancient worldview is that we have to have humility about ourselves and why we are the way we are. We might not like it. We might not like that, our Begriff and Verstand and Vernunft are organized the way they are. We might not like how desperately we need culture, right? We might wish that we could choose everything for ourselves. We might not like that the vast majority of our thoughts are unconscious to us. We might wish that we could be 100% awake and choosing everything. But if we did, that animal would break, because we'd be trying to funnel an infinite amount of information through a finite skull space. Nature has come up with very clever solutions, and we're subject to them, whether we like them or not. This is what he's saying here. This thing is basically a friendly, playful slap in the face against modern ideology and the concept that we make ourselves. There's a way, as Phil was alluding to earlier when he was talking, there's a way in which the modern interpretation of what a person is modeled after the God of Genesis, right? God, from the chaos, God imposes the order of his will and the pattern on the world. And thereby, because his wisdom and goodness are infinite, he's able to create a world that works. And moderns, 500 years ago, they overthrow the medieval Orthodox Church and say, no, we don't need God to do that. We'll do that. With our brains, we will emulate God and we'll choose right and wrong. And we'll decide how people should work. And the ancient says, well, that's not going to end well. This is the ancient perspective, right? The ancient worldview is, that sounds like a recipe for trouble, because you, oh finite animal, lack the capacities of the infinites. You don't know all the things you need to know. You don't have the infinite sense of subtle right and wrong that's required to design something as complicated as a person. You're gonna, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is not just a book of horror, and it's not just a book of science fiction. It is a little bit of ancient wisdom critiquing the modernist mania for being in charge of everything and saying, what would happen? Well, it wouldn't end well. This is a common refrain among the ancients. When moderns dig into ancient philosophy, they often find a substrate of skepticism about human capabilities that moderns take as pessimism. We think it's just bad, that if you say that we can't do everything, if you say that our minds are not like gods, if you say we are not all powerful and almighty and capable of anything, well, then you just must hate people. People often sum up the ancient Greeks by saying they're misanthropic. They just don't like people. But that's not the actual ancient perspective. It just feels that way by comparison with the way moderns can't stop flattering themselves and flattering Homo sapiens and flattering our governments. And, anytime you go to a political rally in the modern world, it's going to be full of, oh, we are so amazing and great, and those bad guys over there suck so bad. There's always this flattery and demonization that's built into the natural idiom of modernity, that in ancient times, you could find examples of that, but there were many more examples of people saying, oh, Homo sapiens, we better be careful about our reach. Right, all those tragedies that were written were all about the limits of human reach, and why we have to be cautious and stay within the lines drawn for us by nature and the gods. There is a not a pessimism, but a skepticism about what people can accomplish. That's essential to the ancient worldview. If we're trying to see the world the way that they could see the world. Before I go on, I'll call on Donald. Go ahead, man. I'm off mute.
Well, I don't know in this case about Kenneth's wordplay, but it seems to me that it's hard to quote deserve without thinking about the movie Unforgiven and William Money's last statement as little Bill lies dying on the floor, complaining that he doesn't deserve to die this way. And William Money says to him, deserve's got nothing to do with it. But I don't know. You'd have to ask Kenneth or something. I don't know. But That's one of the most famous statements of deserve that uses deserve. And the movie was before the paper was written. So I don't know.
Oh, he probably saw it.
Yeah, but this chapter to me raises sort of epistemological issues. You know, that nothing is known unless someone knows it. And yet that someone would have to have been produced by nature. And so what we're knowing here has this other quality that nature has to have given up, produced someone who not only had the raw stuff needed from nature, but the character or characteristics necessary to overcome those self-delusions and whatnot in order to get to this view or this understanding of what the ancients' view was of humanity. And without nature participating in that, without this sort of circle, there's kind of a circle here, you know, we're saying this is what people are like, what human beings are like. And yet we couldn't know that unless nature gave up the right. I use that term. It's like from the French, donner, what that which is given. You know, it's unless, or maybe, yeah, what nature provided all this raw stuff, and then somebody's character and fate caused them to work through whatever delusions there were to come to this understanding and whatever, and had to avoid their own delusions. You know, it's like, I mean, Hegel kind of talks about this more, you know, about how do we know, you know, all the philosophies have this sort of circular thing that they had. How do we know this stuff? Because we are this stuff. And it's not just something naively given to everyone as part of sort of a naive self-consciousness. It's a combination of multiple streams coming together. The raw material from nature, a person's faith, effort, striving, having that character, that we get to these things. And I always wonder, maybe what we're reading is not the truth is not a really good view of what the Greeks thought. It's simply Kenneth's delusion that he is, instead of achieving clarity, achieved a very sophisticated delusion. And how would we separate that given what goes into the creation of human character? Now, I'm not posing this because I think Kenneth is deluded. I surely don't. But because, you know, earlier there was John must have talked about last time. Since all humans are effects generated within the natural order, all are indebted to forces and conditions outside their own influence for what they have been shaped to be. All humans. That includes me, you, Kenneth, whatever. We are things that nature has provided. And our understanding has all the limitations, all the dangers, and somebody had to have come up. Obviously, maybe not obviously. The ancients, the Greeks, had a view, and then Kenneth attempted or tried through study, perseverance, to recapture that view in a way that's just not, you know, making the ancients moderns, but a little different. Well, they were kind of
Right.
funny that way, you know.
Right.
So I think I've confused things enough. but there is I won't say it's not circular, but it's recursive.
It's recursive.
It's recursive in a
Comes
very
back on
deep
itself.
way.
Yeah.
That we are coming to an understanding of how we came to be.
Right.
I mean, this is something that, I mean, I'm sure Kenneth would know far more than I would, you know, that's something that Hegel addressed, was constantly, I think, a concern of Hegel, is that, you know, we can't know about these things unless somebody can get to know them.
Right.
And to know them, they have to understand both the natural part and the sort of characterological part. Go, you can fix everything.
Thank you, Donald. Well, there's good material in what you said. I mean, there's a lot of important stuff here. And part of it is, you know, this existentialist tradition of philosophy doesn't go in for simple categories. You know, God separated light from dark. The end. Now they're separated, right? There is this childlike approach to thinking that noesis loves. Just draw a line, and now there's two different kinds. Draw another line, now there's three or four. And this existentialist tradition doesn't go in for that. It's a modern thing to do, to say it's true or false, good or bad, rich or poor. This kind of zero-dimensional thinking in which things turn into 2 points, and you're either on one point or you're on the other point. And the height of sophistication for a modern is to say, oh no, it's a spectrum. There's a whole spectrum. When they say a whole spectrum between them, they're talking about moving from zero-dimensional thinking to one-dimensional thinking. A line is one dimension. Right now, we go all the way from good to bad. It's like, really? Do you think the world is a single dimension? Right? Space alone is 3 dimensions, and then there's time, and then there's meaning, and all these. We're swimming in dozens or hundreds or millions of dimensions at all times that help us to understand things. But the modern mind, with its sort of reductionistic, oversimplifying, mechanical approach, is constantly trying to strip things down to either or choices, which is why Kierkegaard wrote Either Or, is to talk about the ridiculousness of this relentless effort to simplify things to trivialities. What typifies this existentialist tradition of philosophy is, rather than the mechanical approach to understanding the world that Phil talked about when he talks about set and the knife or the chisel, that we will split the stone into 2 halves, and that this is noesis in a nutshell. Instead, this ancient perspective is that things are not as well understood as machines or things. They're better understood as organisms, as alive, as having a relationship with the universe around them and changing themselves and responding, growing. This dynamic, you know, nature being the word phusis in ancient Greek, meaning becoming. That we are not just a thing, but we are constantly in a process of change. Now, all of this gets captured by Hegel in this idea that the proper philosophical perspective is one of iteration and repetition and coming back to things again and modifying them further. That nothing holds still. Nothing can be understood as a single snapshot, but it has to be understood as a whole life cycle of change over time. And that applies to our own minds as well. You know, what do we do when we're knowing about the world, when we're thinking? Well, what we're doing is this, you know, organismic iterative process that has all this complexity to it. Now, this is what Donald's alluding to, right? In what he's saying.
I guess, Rick, kind of what scares me here is that nature was under no obligation to produce a human being capable of developing the character necessary to obtain the insights that Kenneth did, or Hegel did, or Nietzsche did, or Kierkegaard, or Aristotle, or Plato, or Heraclitus. Nature could have said, screw you guys, y'all can wander in the desert forever, not just 40 years, forever. I don't have to help y'all out. It's just, when I think of the sort of the counterfactual, I hope it's a counterfactual. I don't know that one could demonstrate that it was a counterfactual. But, this is out of our control. This is out of our control in a way that makes modernity being out of control being, a trivial thing. All of this is beyond our will.
Right. And where it gets really interesting, and this is again where the ancients have a so much more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between free will and determinism than moderns do. And moderns, in our caricaturing way, want there either to be free will or everything's determined. And if you just interview people about whether they think we have free will or whether everything's predetermined, you will find a certain number of people say, oh, we have total free will, we can do whatever we want. You'll find other people who say, oh no, everything's predetermined. And you'll find other people who will say first one answer and then the other, depending on what mood they're in and what subject it is. What you won't find in moderns is anyone who has anything other than one of these three trivial caricaturing perspectives on the question. But the whole section E, daimon and eudaimonia, is about this question, right? What is the relationship between the choices you can make and the character you have? Daimon is the metaphor of the character, as we said last week in the ancient worldview. And where it gets really interesting is it's not just a matter of luck of the draw, what did you happen to be born with? Because humans not only have a character, they cultivate their character. They modify their own character. The character is just the starting place. And then they start changing themselves. The moment an infant is unsatisfied with being hungry, or cold, or whatever the very first dissatisfaction of their life is, they begin the process of pushing away from Begriff and developing their Verstand. They start developing noesis. The development of the second mental faculty, Verstand, is a self-cultivation. Now, it may be an unconscious self-cultivation driven by discontent and not planned in advance. But when it gets far enough along, it turns into a self-aware, self-planning consciousness, right? The Verstand does. The intellectual is well aware that he's an intellectual. And so you'd have to search a long time to find an intellectual who didn't know he was an intellectual, because he had to work for it, right? Intellectuals, they struggle to make themselves into intellectuals. It is a long process of self-cultivation. And as Hegel alludes to, and as the Greeks allude to in their more cryptic sense, but Heraclitus does, to get out of the second mental faculty and develop the third one, Vernunft, is also a self-cultivation. It certainly won't happen by accident. I mean, you can get from Begriff to Verstand by accident. And not by accident. You can get to it unconsciously. You can do the long struggle without thinking about it for a long time. You get partway through your life before you even realize you're doing it. But that's because both Begriff and Verstand have a gravity well to them. The third faculty doesn't have a gravity well. You have to fight both of your other faculties to develop Vernunft, the philosophical mature adult perspective, the capacity for thought. And so that is also a long struggle and a process of self-cultivation. So when people look at the ancient Greeks and say, well, were they fatalists? Were they pessimists? Where did they come down? In the simple childlike terms that a modern thinks in terms of, where did ancients come down? Were they pessimists or optimists about human nature? And the answer is, the whole question prejudges the outcome, right? The answer is, you have these capabilities within you that you may or may not exercise, right? Different people, some people may have almost no freedom at all because they barely cultivate themselves except by accident. Other people may have a relatively wide range of freedom that they have fought for their whole life to develop in themselves. And that the difference between the two is enormous. Enormous. This is why you can't say that the ancient Greeks are simply pessimists. Aristotle, when asked how different is the cultivated mind from the uncultivated mind, his answer was, as the living are from the dead. It's like there's so much of a difference. It's like an uncultivated person who's never struggled to develop themselves might as well be a corpse by comparison with the range of freedom that someone can develop in themselves if they lived in a culture that would permit it. Now, our culture doesn't really permit it. We don't get, moderns don't get very far, as this book will examine, but we could get a lot farther than we do. So, this doesn't lend itself to a simple assessment of the Greeks were optimists or the Greeks were pessimists. What the Greeks thought is your character is hugely decisive upon you, and you can cultivate your character and change it so that what it is that's decisive upon you can improve, or you could miscultivate it and it could get worse. There is a huge range here, but at any given moment in time, your character is driving you. These things need to be examined. They need to be studied, because whether the outcome is good or bad depends upon the state of your character, the state of the character you actually have at that moment that's calling the shots for you. Now, this is a nuanced but very specific kind of model of human consciousness and free will. And it was widespread in the ancient world and is almost entirely absent in the modern world. We just don't think about the world this way now. So, oh, Rama, you got a question?
Yes, yes, I do. So, did Ken discuss about individuality and what defines individuality, and
Yes.
how does ancient individuality be different from modern individuality?
That's a great question. It's a great question, Rama. Thank you. That's what this whole section E is about. This whole section E, daimon and eudaimonia, is about this very question, because according to the ancient perspective, if you don't consciously cultivate yourself, if all you do is unconsciously drift according to the direction of your character, then you really don't have any individuality. As a person, you're a symptom of your character, of the character that you started with. You end up being just the consequences, like a logical syllogism. If I write down 2 + 2 = 4, how much individuality does that have? And the answer is, well, none, because if you add 2 + 2, under standard conditions, you have to get 4. It's the 4 is just a symptom of the starting conditions and the operation that was done upon them. If you imagine, instead of an arbitrary operation, that the operation that's happening is your character, right? Your condition, your starting personality and the world you live in, when they intersect through your character, generate the consequence of who you become. Now you're just talking about deterministic, fatalistic arithmetic, the fatality of character, as Kenneth Smith says it. But if you actively engage with your character, if you study it and learn how it works and then start cultivating it, you can change it and go in a different direction. Now, as Phil talks about, you're sort of becoming an artist of yourself in part. And you could be a sort of crazed modernist artist who paints everything orange just to say, behold orange, in which case your character is a weird distortion. Or you could be someone who's paying a lot of attention to what's healthy in the world around you, what's important to pay attention to, and what should you be noticing, and what should you be driven to do. And if you're cultivating those things in a healthy direction, you could individuate enormously and become really a person and not just a symptom.
Does Ken go into how you go about that journey where you are going into the questions of individuality? Are you doing that with the community or by yourself? Because it would be very difficult to do it by yourself, everything by yourself.
Yes. Yes. He says that Homo sapiens needs culture. We need a community. Right. And it's part of what makes it difficult for philosophers under modernity is that the philosophical mind, Vernunft, is suppressed by modernity. That is to say, it's very hard to put together a culture that will help us cultivate ourselves in a healthy, mature adult way. Whereas, in Athens, in the classical period, that was easier to do because the community was actually trying to generate people who could engage in Vernunft. So I think he would say you're right, Rama, that although it's an individual struggle that you have to take responsibility for, you really can't succeed at it unless you can get some support from the culture around you.
I have an observation to make.
Yeah, shoot.
That philosophy is probably more prevalent during the ancient Greek. And I also observed that at a similar time, both in India and China as well, that was true. The timings is probably 400 BC, 300, 500 to 200 BC is right. When there's a similar thing happening all over the world.
Right. Yeah, this is one of the things this book talks about. So I'm glad you brought this up. We'll as we go back to the text, we'll be getting into some of these questions. And he's got a whole other book, which is all about the human character types and how to cultivate them. But so these are great questions. We'll be talking about the answers to your question. Will take years. We'll be talking about this for years.
True. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Rama. All right, Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, as the conversation continues, I wonder whether we're not moving into a new dimension in this sense. I mean, previously there was, in a sense, a struggle between civilization and nature, in some sense, to find some kind of balance or compromise or some kind of thing that one could exist in. I wonder whether contemporary existence is now not so weighted down that in a sense it's really like crushing our spirit in this sense. And what I mean is the emergence of technology itself. In other words, Seth continues on. And now humanity is fighting a two-front war. On the one hand, how to exist in relationship to nature, but how to also exist in relationship to the weight of technology itself. Technology have become so powerful that I'm thinking now Sisyphus, instead of pushing the rock up the hill to struggle about himself in relationship to what resists, now he has to push two big rocks, one on each hand, in a two-front war. I mean, I'm thinking that the decisive moment in a way happened kind of in the 20s or 30s, when there was just a very delicate balance between technology and the humanity. And that's why Charles Lindbergh was such a hero, because he was still able to find a place in which the humanity, the potentiality of his spirit could struggle against this machine in relationship to crossing the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, of course, now it's no big deal. You just buy a ticket. You can get across the Atlantic Ocean, no problem, right? So the heroic act is no longer there, right? Because the technology has overcome the individual. And we see this in the internet, we see it everywhere, that the individuality of the thing. I was thinking about that metaphor. Prior to that metaphor, I was thinking about how do you resist the power of nature? Let's say if you're swimming to across the shore to the other shore in this raging river. the worst thing you could do is to swim straight up against the water. Not going to get you anywhere, right? Or just jump in and let it flow because you're going to end up into the waterfall. The way you do it is diagonally, right? You swim up the river somewhat, but diagonally. So you drift down the water, but you make progress, and you're not going to land exactly opposite. It's really the hypotenuse, which is sort of interesting between the forces. And when I was thinking about that, I said, the diagonal is kind of an interesting thing. That really is my idea about equivocation, about working in both sides. And I'm thinking about sailing. How do you sail upwind? You do it diagonally. It's called tacking, which humanity has to have not only power, but tact.
Yeah. Yeah.
In relationship to nature and whatever.
Yeah.
But now we don't have to do tacking. We have propellers.
Right.
You just get a motorboat and you say, what in the hell are you doing tacking? We don't have to be tactful. We just overpower nature. Right? So
Right.
now, like I said, as an individual, tact no longer matters. Try to go into a conversation with somebody who's belligerent and just be tactful.
Yeah.
He doesn't hear a damn thing.
Yeah. That's
He
right.
is gonna shout you down like
That's right.
WWF wrestling. That's what it is. That is a contemporary tact. To be a WWF wrestler.
Yeah.
And so I wonder whether our old methods of tactfulness actually work these days under a modern concept, a modern culture in which we have to not only fight against nature for existence, but also fight against ourselves. Like somebody said, we discover the enemy and the enemy is ourselves.
Right.
And there's the problem.
Yeah.
And I think what we found, even in Hegel, you say, the ego has within it the otherness.
Yeah.
And that's how we could relate to nature, because the otherness, which is in nature, is already in us.
Yes.
But if the otherness is just merely a mirror image of ourselves, we're fighting against ourselves only. We're not fighting against otherness, because we are the otherness as well. So we're fighting a very, very vicious war. How Germany lost is because they got themselves into a two-front war. I'm not singing hymns to Germany, by the way, but I'm just saying, like, that was a major mistake, right?
Yeah.
The fact that Seth has managed to get us fighting into a two-front war, we did it to ourselves. Is what I'm saying,
Yeah.
So this is a very, very, how did somebody say it? The first battle you lose is a tragedy. The second battle you lose is a farce.
Yes.
We are living in a farce. That's where the problem is. Now, I don't want to laugh too much about it because, I'm still sort of struggling against this. It's still worth a fight, but nonetheless.
Well, I have a little ancient terminology for you that might help here. I think we've talked about it before, but there's this, what you're saying ties directly into what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, two of the ancient Greeks' favorite terms were chaos and cosmos, and they didn't mean by those what we think they meant, generally speaking. These terms originate from the Greek military formation. That's the source. And they have to do with the balance between competition and cooperation. Just like free will and determinism, we moderns tend to caricature it into these ridiculous zero-dimensional positions. We do the same with competition or cooperation. We say either competition is good and we should all be fighting each other all the time, or cooperation is good and nobody should ever fight against anybody ever. And we think it's one or the other, right? Because zero-dimensional points that's pretty much what a modern is addicted to. But the ancient perspective was a lot more nuanced than this. They observed that if everybody's fighting everybody, you don't have a military fighting unit, you have chaos. That's useless. Chaos is easily defeated by an organized force. And any group that just believes competition is the answer to all things ends up losing because they can't stop fighting each other. Ironically, that's exactly what would happen to the Greeks at a large scale because they couldn't keep their city-states from fighting each other. So, for a group that had a really clear analysis of this, they also, at the same time, it was their tragic blind spot. But what they understood was, if you can get your fighting force to stop fighting each other and to point their swords and shields in the same direction in a coordinated fashion, then out of chaos, you have created a cosmos. You've created an organism. Now the group of people, instead of acting like chaos, it acts like a single organism. This is the metaphor that the Greeks are always using. It's a life form. And as a life form, it can sense its environment. Its parts can coordinate and communicate with each other to tell each other about what they're sensing. And as a group, they can adjust. If so you see somebody coming at you from behind, the guy in the back can go, "Whoa, there's people coming from behind," and the whole group can turn and orient towards it so that you can't be easily defeated. Now, that only works if you've got a high level of cooperation. If all you have is internal competition, you don't do that, right? It's every man for himself, and the guy in the back says, "I'll just keep this a secret and the rest of my team will die and I'll win because I'll be the survivor," right? This is modernist thinking, right? There can only be one winner. So cosmos versus chaos. When the Greek myths talk about, in the beginning there was chaos, and they talk about the different ways in which the cosmos was formed, they're not saying how the universe was formed. They're saying how the organismic orderliness of the universe was formed. How did they come to harmonize with each other so that they could reinforce each other and behave like an organism? That's what this is talking about. Well, that's not how we read it because we're moderns, but that was always the key subject, because for them, going back to their archaic origins as a military force that invaded the Hellenic Peninsula, this was their primary concern. This was their claim to fame. This is how they were able to conquer and take over and become Greeks, is that they functioned as a cosmos and not as a chaos. So on the subject of chaos versus cosmos, Heraclitus has these. This section E is all, for those who weren't here in previous weeks, section E is all about Heraclitus. Kenneth Smith adores Heraclitus, and anytime you're talking about daimon or character, you're talking about some of Kenneth Smith's and some of mine favorite fragments that talk about the nature of character and human choice and freedom and daimons and so forth. So Heraclitus talks about competition and cooperation, and what he says is war is the father of all things, which makes you think that he's pushing towards the individualist, let's all fight each other. But then he says, that people should fight for their common law as fiercely as they fight for the city wall, that you can't afford to be fighting amongst each other. You have to be organized into a cosmos through the lawfulness of your community. So how can he be saying both things at the same time? The modern says, well, which side does he come down on? Is it cooperation or competition? What is he in favor of? Well, he has a small number of very pregnant fragments that resolve this, where he says the hidden harmony is best. He says, people do not understand how that which is at variance with itself nevertheless agrees with itself. There is a power in the bending back, as in the case of the bow and the lyre. And this is his statement of dialectics, where he says, there are forms of competition that produce harmony. And those forms of competition are different from other forms of competition, right? Having everybody compete is useless. Having everybody cooperate gets you a certain distance, but you don't really catch on fire until you find that special form of competition that is also a form of cooperation. This is the dialectic. So the string of the bow and the wood of the bow are in conflict with each other. They're tugging in opposite directions. And that conflict creates a dynamic system that makes it possible to fire the arrow, just like the dynamic system of the lyre makes it possible to produce musical notes. This is Heraclitus's hidden harmony, that there is in between chaos and cosmos, and not in some compromised position. There is some place that you can find where chaos and cosmos themselves are harnessed together into a dynamic system that is both at the same time, that transcends either category and becomes something neither of those taken to an extreme could have envisioned, and neither could any compromise envision it. The metaphor I like to think about on this is a raft, right? Or let's say a sailboat, and let's start without a sail. It's just a boat, and you're sitting out there on the water. Now you're not going anywhere. You might slowly drift with the tide, but that's it. Now, you could get a paddle and start moving yourself by main force. And, when you're a certain age, you're highly impressed with this is great. I was just sitting there, but now through my efforts, I'm able to go places, and this is spectacular. This is the individual, doing their thing. But you get more power when you discover the sail. And you discover that if you put up something to catch the wind is stronger than you are. It's older than you are. It's deeper than you are. It's bigger than you are. It's this great current in the world. And if you can catch that current, it can move the boat faster than you can paddle. And also you're not exhausted from paddling, right? So far, so good. And so people, for thousands of years have been making boats with sails. But there's an even better trick that people who've never sailed don't really know. They tend to misunderstand. The best position for the sail, you don't want a tight sail that is exactly catching the wind. I mean, yes, it's better than just sitting there. It's better than paddling, but you actually aren't moving nearly as fast as you can. What you want is a sail with a little bit of bend and slack in it, and you want to turn it at an angle to the wind. Because what you really want is the wind to be blowing over one of the surfaces and pulling the sail. You don't want the wind to push the sail. You want the wind to pull the sail, right? It forms that airfoil shape that's the same shape as the cross-section of an airplane wing. When the wind tugs on it, when it hits it at just the right angle, and suddenly, instead of the wind shoving your raft is being sucked into the vacuum caused by the wind passing over the outer curve of the sail. The difference in velocity is amazing. If you've never been in a sailboat and had them illustrate this to you, putting the sail flat onto the wind, yeah, you're moving, but the moment you hit that special angle and the wind runs along the outside of the sail and tugs it forward, your speed will double. I mean, it's amazing. You're in the presence of some kind of hidden harmony. There's some kind of invisible power here where you're halfway between conflict and cooperation. They're harnessed together in a special way. This is that thing that the ancients understood when it comes to chaos and cosmos. That what you want to do is organize them into a dynamic system with a dialectical relationship that catches the powers in exactly the right configuration, so that what's happening is not some compromise. It's not chaos. It's not cosmos. It's not a compromise between chaos and cosmos. It's a third way that you can only discover when they're in the right dialectical relationship. This is the relationship between Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft. Vernunft is neither Verstand nor Begriff, but then put into the right dialectical relationship so that your mind can dilate and you can escape the addictions of the two systems. Stephen, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I was following that story, the Chamberlain case where the baby was taken by a dingo. This is about 40 years ago, the Azaria Chamberlain case. Meryl Streep made a movie about it. I was watching this 40 years ago, and I was aware of certain things about nature, and that is, up until that point in time, the average Aussie would go out in his old car, get out his gun and shoot at anything that moved. Fortunately for nature, they were usually lousy shots. But nature went way down. A lot of animals were shot out. It's like the crocodiles. They were sort of verging on extinction at one point. Nobody particularly cared. Anyway, all the newfangled thinking came in that guns are bad and we shouldn't, wipe out the animals or something like that. And they came back. You had lots of crocodiles suddenly appearing and people were being attacked by crocodiles. When you have lots of them, people are thinking, how can that happen? How in the modern world can a crocodile creep up and grab somebody? How can somebody be eaten by nature? How can that happen? It's impossible. It was the same thing with the dingoes. They had learned a long time ago to be very wary of humans with guns. You didn't see a dingo, they didn't want to be seen, but then the guns were taken away. The humans were going to the camping grounds and dingoes came up and they were throwing food at them. The dingoes had increased vastly in number and they'd lost their fear of humans. Oh, well, a dingo picks up a baby and takes it away and nobody can accept it. A guy wrote a book called Evil Angels and he pointed out what came up again and again is people cannot accept that things just happen. Somebody had to have intended that to happen. Human intent is all pervasive. If we intend that we never suffer from wild nature, that is the rule. It cannot be broken. And another aspect is everyone thought, how could a dog take a baby? Dingoes are just little puppy dogs. And what I'd learnt when I was young is the wild counterpart of the domestic animal, the feral cat is twice as strong as a domestic cat. And people couldn't accept, they don't realise that these dingoes are twice as strong as your domestic dog. This just went on for years. That originally they came to the correct conclusion that the baby had been taken by a dingo, but people couldn't leave it alone. All the experts piled in. Too many cooks spoiled the broth because human intent rules the universe.
Or so we
if
think.
Things happen, it must have been that somebody intended it.
That's right. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that childhood song, there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. It is astonishing how much wisdom there is in that simple little song that nevertheless eludes almost all of our most sophisticated political and economic systems. Like Stephen is saying, we are constantly thinking that we can control things by imposing our intentions. But that's what the old lady who swallowed a fly did. It's like, then she tried the spider, and then she just kept thinking, well, I will fix this problem by doing the next thing. And in each case, there were unintended consequences. And this is the challenge for noesis, this faculty that we have. It's constantly telling us to intervene to make things better. But the possible things that could happen are infinite, but our mind is finite. And so our plan is always missing most of the picture. And, not just what we planned happens, although sometimes even that doesn't happen, but enormous number of things we did not plan also happen. And this is just the human condition in a nutshell. And so there needs to be this dialectical dynamic relationship between how much of the world we just agree to suffer as a pathos and how much of the world we feel inclined to intervene in and try to change through praxis. There needs to be a balance between the two. If we, this is the ancient perspective, right? If we overreach and become hyper Apollonian and think, well, the unexamined life is not worth living, that there should be nothing that we have not chosen and decided for ourselves, we end up with modernity where, we're constantly intervening, to fix one problem and constantly setting in motion a host of other problems. And then we're like, well, who could have foreseen that? The answer is, well, all the ancients foresaw that. Anybody who seriously took the song of the little old lady who swallowed a fly could have foreseen this. It's basic to the human condition, and yet it keeps surprising moderns. How can it be that things didn't come out exactly the way that I wanted them to? Heraclitus says, it's going to come up in the next paragraph, It would not be better for men if they got what they wanted. Our plans are just full of problems. All right, so let's go back to the text. We're still in the first half of the fourth paragraph. He says, as the ultimate reservoir from which we draw our profoundest insights, our daimones will necessarily bias every judgment or insight we try to muster to evaluate or understand them. Now, when he says daimones, this is what we talked about last week, right? The daimon is the metaphor of human character, that your character rules over you like a god rules over some domain of nature. But the domain of nature of a daimon is just your character, the parts of yourself that are unexamined, your unconscious, your tendencies, what you want and don't want, what you notice and don't notice, all that stuff. That's the realm of your character, of your daimon, and because that's the realm of the daimon, it means that when we try to think about things, it is subject to the daimon, right? An infinite number of things present themselves before us, and we only pick out 7 plus or minus 2. And that picking out part and that enormous obscuring part, all that happened unconsciously. That was our daimon in action. And that means that if we try to turn our consciousness around to look at consciousness itself, to look at our character and say, well, who are we? How are we making decisions? How are we wanting? What kind of person are we and how should we cultivate that? We are immediately presented with the problem that we are asking the daimon to evaluate the daimon. And the daimon is obscuring most of the picture and just picking out certain things, right? And that includes if it looks at itself. Most of the daimon will be invisible to the daimon when we try to wield it consciously as a tool to examine our own character. We're just going to end up with an abstraction of our character, a handful of things that we decide, well, these must be the important parts of our character. Ipso facto, it must be true because we decided. And yet, in fact, our actual character is more complex than that. And we might not even be picking out the most important parts. We're just picking out the parts that it seemed to us, according to our character, were important. So this is what he's describing here is a chicken and egg problem in which our character limits our ability to examine our character. It's recursive, as Donald said earlier, right? We have a problem of this is where, you know, the ancient philosophical reluctance to reduce everything down to true or false or good or bad or up or down, that thing that moderns can't stop themselves from doing, was not an itch that the ancients felt that they had to scratch. They're perfectly happy with a basic model of human character that's recursion, that includes recursion and the ability to describe highly complex, nuanced situations easily. Just something we're bad at as moderns. Dogma, doxa, praxis, and pathos. Stephen puts in the these are all critical terms from ancient Greek philosophy. So let's move on to the second half of this fourth paragraph. This is where he's gonna draw this point to a close here. As a result of what we were just talking about, so no mortal is competent to be judge in his own case. This is our problem. You know, Rama asked earlier about, you know, to what extent do we need support from a culture around us of other people to cultivate ourselves? If we wanted to develop that mature Vernunft faculty of the mind to be, you know, to have the full capacity that human beings are capable of, that capacity that's so important that, you know, Aristotle contrasted it, you know, as mattering as much as being alive from being dead. So it's everything to the Greeks. The problem is, when it comes to cultivating our character, we're not competent to evaluate our own character very effectively. We are bad judges. It's really important to supplement our own warped perspective with other people's perspectives, because maybe their warpages will be different from ours. And if we compare the two, it will allow us to notice things we would miss otherwise. And it'll allow us to correct some of the warpage in our own perspective. You need a community of people all looking at the same thing from different angles to say, I know from your angle it looks round, but from my angle it looks square. You guys ever seen that object? From one side it looks like a circle, from another side it looks like a triangle, and from another side it's a square. It's a physical object. You can actually make it with a lathe or you know, and a saw out of wood. and then hang it there and illuminate it. And if you hit it from three right angles, it'll cast 3 shadows, one of which is a triangle, one of which is a square, and one of which is a circle, but it's the same object, right? And it illuminates the problem of perspective, that if you're only looking at things from one perspective, you're getting a massively distorted picture of what it really is. It's not until you can move all the way around a thing that you can go, huh, what a strange object that is. And I can see why I would misunderstand it from these perspectives. So, we need help from other people tackling the same problem from other angles to understand things. And we need help. This is the recurring issue of the relative strengths of gnosis and noesis. We need help from reality, because reality is objectively true. And so any opportunity we can give reality to knock some sense into our heads, to prove our ideas false, or at least incomplete, improves the quality of our perspectives and understanding. Thus science, sort of. He then says, it is the very perversity of a malignant daimon that it generates illusory clarity, smug self-complacency, a sense of perfect superiority, just where they are least merited. What he's saying here is that feeling that we all have, that we know ourselves, that we are good judges of ourselves, that we know who we are, we know what our strengths and weaknesses are. He says, of all the things that are false, nothing could be more false than that. As Hegel says, what is familiar is for that very reason not recognized for what it truly is. And there's nothing we're more familiar with than ourselves, which means we are habitual in the parts of ourselves that we ignore, that we don't notice, that we explain, rationalize away, and then forget about afterwards. Our powers of excusing our own problems are, by the point we start philosophizing, they have matured into proficiencies. We're brilliant at covering up the flaws in our personality that would otherwise disturb us, because we've been doing it for decades. What is that annoying habit that we don't even notice, but when we try to live with somebody else, they're like, Jesus, you always do this thing. We're like, no, I don't. Like snoring. How many people think they don't snore? But the first time you share a bed with somebody else, they're like, you snore like anything. Here's a recording of you snoring. And there you are going, I was sure I didn't snore. I knew I didn't snore. This is a metaphor, right? Snoring is a simple case, but literally everything about our character falls into this. It's all a distortion of things that we are familiar with, either covering up or focusing on. And so he's saying, this illusory clarity, smug self-complacence, sense of perfect superiority, all this stuff is his way of summarizing that, we have to be more careful in assessing ourselves than any other thing, because it's where we are most prone to error. We have the most conflicts of interest when it comes to summing ourselves up than any other thing that we might try to assess, because we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to win. We want to be the winner. We don't want to be the person who keeps our partner awake snoring all night. That wasn't part of our recipe for ourselves, right?
A sterling example is Rick out of Red Dwarf. His appraisal of himself constantly throughout the entire series, to the point where he builds a museum devoted to his ego.
I love that character so much. Oh my God, he's so good. Yes. Watching an egomaniac at work is an important object lesson for the rest of us, right? Because we're all egomaniacs. Even the most humble of us is only humble by comparison with other human beings who are, egomaniacs. So, these are important comparisons. But the point is, he opens this clause by saying, it is the very perversity of a malignant daimon. In other words, a distorted character. What makes a character distorted is that it causes you to overemphasize some things and underemphasize others, such that what you're paying attention to and how you're assessing it is incorrect and leading you in unhealthy directions. And no human character is perfect. We've all got distortions in our character, some more than others, but we all have a lot. So he's saying that the reason why we're so complacent about our own character is because it's the character itself and its distortions that are imposing that sense of complacency upon us. After all, the domain of the daimon is, what do we want or not want? What do we notice or not notice? What do we evaluate well or evaluate poorly? So that includes evaluating yourself and your own character. Before I go on, I'll call on Phil. Go ahead, sir.
Well, you thought about what's the distorted character. I agree. Everybody's character is distorted to a certain degree. So that I agree with totally. However, if you move in a society, a civilization in which every individual is essentially distorted, I don't think you could construct a whole out of the multiple distortions. All you could do is reflect on yourself that you're probably as distorted as they are, or at least to some degree, you don't have a right. Okay. What I'm saying is that what it does is that it reintroduces to you that things are to a certain degree ambiguous or it's incomplete, which means that you are still dangling in this sort of floating cloud of uncertainty to a certain degree. And to what degree can you in an 8.5 tie the main character to the ground? I mean, like, yes, I think once you accept that, then you accept that in a better way. You probably have a bit more compassion for other people's distortions, but you certainly have even more skepticism about somebody who says, this is the truth. I'm going to tell you the truth. Like, yeah, right. It's how you would answer it, right? But which means that anybody that even professes that they could project that, like eventually will get it right, then maybe you have some uncertainty about that, because all you know, at least at the moment, is that we are in this partial hall mirrors, or maybe a total hall mirror. And not only that, a hall mirror in which the glass is fractured in some sense. And so, yeah, once you accept that, then in a sense, on the one hand, there is more room for creativity of reconstructing, recomposing, reorganizing, but you know that this is not an absolute truth. I mean, there is a funny relationship between, in that sense, art and truth, because art could only show you the partial truth. That's why it's always, to me, art is always kind of an open question, right? It leads you to a question rather than an answer, And maybe you could say a question that has a degree of, let's say, grounding, that you could say, oh, this is not the truth, but it is at least a rest stop. Like that, like, are we there? Yes and no. Well, could we at least make a rest stop? Because I got to go to the restroom. I mean, I think that's about all you could do in a sense, and then you have to kind of nonetheless go along with your own desires to a certain degree, but with some doubt that, you need to, keep somewhat circumspect and quiet. I think that leads me to, that just came up. That really leads to the whole notion of the public and the private, right? I remember once when I was at Skidmore, and a very famous critic, I happen to know him because I studied with him. He came and we had dinner together and with some other faculty. And he asked a question like, what is your sex life like? Like all these guys, they were so anxious for the guy to recognize them, that they start spilling. And afterwards, I was kind of laughing with this guy. I said, like, if you had asked me that question, I would say, that's between me and God. Keep quiet. I mean, that's a private issue. But like, we are now living in a world too in which everybody wants to make the the private into the public. You know,
Right.
I actually learned this lesson in a hard way. I remember when after my graduation, I was doing some part-time teaching, you know, all over the Bay Area, and so I knew color theory pretty well. And this guy, who was actually my best friend at that time, was at a party, and he pulled out a stack of what's called what is it, the color node or something. I remember, I forgot what it was, and he was sorting it out. He said, "Look at this. Look, when I do this, it becomes this way, and then when I do this becomes this way." He said he thought he discovered a secret of some kind of secret about color.
Yeah.
And you know, I kept telling him, no, you got it. And then finally I told him, like, yeah, you discovered something over for sure, but what you discover is somebody else's system. Right? This guy got so angry that he threw me, his best friend, out of the house. He said, "Get the hell out of here," right? And I was so angry that he would do that, because I was trying to like straighten him out to a certain degree, that I wouldn't come back to this house. And finally, the guy who was the teacher at that time, you know, he finally came to me and says, "Phil, you're actually wrong." And I said, "Well, how could I be wrong? I was just trying to help him out, you know, through a friend." And he says, "You're wrong because you don't understand that a man's home is his house is his home, you know, his castle." Okay, that's what he says. He said, "We are all imperfect, and we have a right to be imperfect in our home. And you should have realized at some point that all of us sort of left the conversation." He said, "The problem is you're too much of a liberal, and you thought that you could correct him." And he said, once you realize that he wasn't going to give up his private errors, you should have just backed off and, you know, let's turn to another subject, right? And so he said, because you violated a very sacred a right of somebody is to be imperfect, at least in his home. And so I was wrong, you know. I sort of made up with him slowly. I didn't do it, but you know, and then he apologized as well for throwing me out of his house. But so that was a very important lesson for me to understand the relationship between the public and the private. We all have a right to certain defects.
Yeah.
Because we are not perfect beings. So we cannot live in a glass house. Okay. So that's important to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, the distinction between the public and the private was incredibly important to the ancients. They took it for granted as a basic structuring element for their civilizations. The Romans did it, the Greeks did it, everybody did it. And Hannah Arendt writes about it a lot in her book, The Human Condition, where she talks about, you know, what did they think belonged in the private realm and what belonged in the public realm and what belonged in the political realm. They had these very clear ideas. And it drew out of the things we're talking about here, about human character and modes of thinking and so forth. So it's incredibly important stuff. So let's see how much further we can get in our remaining hour today. So he's been talking about this problem of trying to use your character to, you know, using the tools your character provides to evaluate the character itself. You have a lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps problem, only worse. You're trying to use a warped lens to evaluate where a lens might be warped. It's the same lens. It's trying to look back on itself and, you know, what a coincidence. Certain things just don't appear to be warped when it looks at itself. Oh, it looks fine to me. Of course it does. That's its job. That's what it's been doing all along, is telling you those things are fine. You need another lens. And that's the purpose of this entire book, is, you know, to try to learn to think in other lens systems so that we can then use those lens systems to look at ourselves and go, whoa, oh my goodness. You mean I'm like this? I never realized that. So he says, the Greek concept of a daimon argues that, ironically, human beings in every case are complicitous with their own seductive and subliminal inner fate. Fate is not coercion. It is instead self-oppression, self-blindness, self-deception. We are fated to collaborate in that conspiracy, which is our fate. So, you know, he's not saying here that everything that happens in your life is your fault. That's a simplistic modernist reduction. typically loved by one particular political party. But he's also not saying that you're completely helpless and that everything that happens to you is just an accident and, it's somebody else's fault. That's a typical position of a different political party. This is typical of modernity, that they choose two caricatured extreme positions and say, well, this is the whole possible range of opinions you could have on this subject. What they're saying instead is that in addition to all the things from outside that are pushing on you all the time in different ways, in addition to your circumstances, what you were born into and how people treat you, at all times, you are also being pushed from the inside by your character. And it is in the intersection of these two things that your fate turns out, right? It's not one side or the other. They're both like the string and the wood of the bow. It's not that the string is doing all the work and it's not that the bow is doing all the work. You remove either one from the equation, you don't have a bow and you can't fire an arrow. But we're constantly trying to explain human fatedness by removing either the string or the wood, right? Either it's all the outside stuff or it's all the inside stuff. The ancients understood it is the dialectical relationship between your character and the things that are happening to you that determine your fate. And because nature outside you is constantly shifting and changing, and your own character is growing and changing over time, and you can be cultivating that change of your character and cultivating the world around you. For these reasons, there isn't a simple cartoon answer to the question of what you're fated to do. It's infinite in scale. It's complex. So many factors come into play. Even though at any given moment, something happens, and that something that happens might be reasonably well understood by a finite mind, the next moment, another thing is happening. And also, the world and your character are both changing in response to what happened. When you take the ancient perspective for granted that things are not Legos that snap together and unsnap, they're not machines. When you take the ancient perspective that things are organisms that are growing and adapting and noticing each other. So that means the world is an organism and your character is an organism, and the interaction between the two, the dynamic system, is also an organism. Organisms at multiple scales, all responding to each other. You start to be able to describe the complexity we actually experience in our own lives about the relationship between choice and fate, free will and determinism, all these questions. They start to map pretty well onto this model. As Donald knows, when you're doing software engineering, if you're teaching software engineering, first you teach people the simple basics. But to get the real power going, to be able to make really powerful software systems, you start to teach them feedback loops, recursion, and other forms of iteration in which the system doesn't just act, but then it checks to see what the consequences were of its action, takes that into account, and makes another action. That ability to incrementally, iteratively improve over time, that's more like an organism and less like an object. And that's where the real complexity of nature and human personality come from. And to the Greeks, that was the normal metaphor. That's how you understood a person and what their choices were. When you think that this was a widespread understanding of human nature, it's sort of astonishing to look at modern versions of how people work and how trivial and cartoonish they are. It's weird because we think that we are the pinnacle of civilization. Even the skeptics among us, who are, even people who are downers and pessimists, still think, they still buy the dogma that this is as good as it could get. Modernity is the peak. So, if they are pessimists and have decided that we suck, ipso facto, all previous civilizations must have sucked worse. They still believe in the Great March of Progress, even as pessimists, because they're moderns. They can't get it out of their head. They've been marinating it in all their life. So what's completely inexpressible to most moderns is the idea that our understanding of the relationship between choice and fate, between free will and determined, that is just ridiculously cartoonish, and people didn't used to think that way. People used to have sophisticated understandings of, what are you free to do and what are you not free to do, and how do you modify these conditions? People had some pretty sophisticated ideas about this stuff that we don't have anymore. When Kenneth Smith says modernity creates a flatland that pushes down to eliminate Vernunft, the adult mental faculty, to make a more predictable, more mechanical, more controllable civilization that can be managed, in great big numbers because people are more like each other than they ever were before in the history of the world, even while thinking they're all individuals. This is what he's talking about. That our tools for understanding literally everything that matters are like sticks and stones. They're weird little children's tools. But we don't know that about ourselves. We think we're using the most sophisticated models of all time, the most objective, the most scientific, the most rational. We don't get what little toys these are. And the reason we don't get that is because we don't study history in a way that would expose to us the places where they're better than we are. We only study history to attempt to prove to ourselves that we're better than they are. Haha, those primitive savages of the past. If only they were as smart as we are. If only they had science like we do. If only they were as rational as we are. This is where we begin every time we crack open a history book. Let me read now about these ancient primitives and how they weren't as good as we are. This is what we teach people in school, how to read history. They didn't know yet. They hadn't invented yet. They hadn't discovered yet. They were superstitious. They were ignorant. This is how we summarize the past. What we don't say is every epoch has its strengths and weaknesses. There are some things we're better at than they are, and there's other things that they're better at than we are. Maybe we should study the things they're better at than we are so that we can learn something from them. This is not the way we teach history. And you would say, well, wouldn't that be a scientific approach? I mean, isn't it obvious that you should be looking at different epochs that way? Why wouldn't we do that if we claim to be the most scientific civilization of all time? And the answer is ideology. We are subject to ideologies. And until we know what they are, we don't know how they're distorting the way we ask every question and what answers we go looking for. This is what he's talking about here. This is the irony he's saying. We're participating, right? We're collaborating in the creation of our fate. We are not the authors of our fate, but we're collaborators with the world in creating our fate. This is what 24 years of therapy taught me about my own life, whether I liked it or not. How many things that in year one of counseling, I was like, why do those people do those things? And how come these unfair things happen? And blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, I was only willing to look at half the picture of my own life. The half I was not willing to look at is, why didn't I write down in my calendar that I had an appointment on that day? Why did I just try to remember it as a test for my memory? And then when I missed the appointment, I wanted to blame somebody else. But, I was participating, right? I didn't use the tools available to me because my character was telling me that everything's supposed to be a test. I was laying landmines in my own path to try to test myself and prove whether or not I deserved whatever it was I wasn't certain that I deserved. So I was creating problems for myself in my life, right? It's not that I was the cause of all problems, but I was a participant. I wasn't helpless. I was half the member of this dance. My character was participating in the dance.
Your worst enemy, because the enemy within will accompany you everywhere. The other enemies are only there some of the time.
Yeah, the other enemies you can walk away from, but no matter where you go, as Buckaroo Banzai says, there you are. It's the part you're carrying with you. Sharon says, I would like to be optimistic. The daimon is a subject to a developmental process which may produce mental giants or dwarfs, right? Is this a function of our free will? Of course, what Kenneth is saying is partially, right? Our character partially gives us free will and partially gives us determinism. It's some of each, right? It depends on to what extent are we collaborating and cultivating our character to change it in a healthier direction. Also, it's a question of to what extent is the culture around us supporting the healthy development of our character. I mean, you can be really self-blind, but if you grow up in the right kind of culture, you will naturally cultivate into a healthier and healthier character because the culture around you is doing half the work for you. But by the same token, you could be born with a spectacular character, but if all around you is a culture that is denying the development of Vernunft and encouraging you to develop in a strictly Begriff or Verstand direction, it's going to be really hard for you to cultivate your character in a healthy direction. You might actively cultivate it in an unhealthy direction that you've mistaken for a healthy direction. The moment you get feedback loops like this, where the thing that is acting can change itself, you get levels of complexity. They're very hard to sum up. In software, here's another thing Donald could tell you. Most designers of programming languages carefully design the architecture of the language to avoid, above all things, to avoid the ability for a program to rewrite itself. The thing that they tell you in school you must absolutely never do is write software that modifies itself. Software should be static, they say. It should only modify the data. Because the moment the program can start rewriting itself, you can't prove anymore what the program will do, right? You've lost control. It's now an organism. And that's this is the thing they tell you not to do in college. You can't write provably correct software because you're losing the ability to prove anything about it. It's the levels of complexity that are possible when software rewrites itself go beyond our ability to measure. You've now entered the realm of the infinite, right? You write a little multiplication program, that's a finite program. It multiplies two numbers together. That's easy. You can understand it. But the moment you add a line to that program that allows it to replace some of its instructions with other instructions, now all bets are off. This thing, it could do an infinite number of things. It depends on what it rewrote itself to do. So what we're talking about here is the difference between the finite and the infinite. Organisms have within them, because they can rewrite themselves to some extent, they have within them part of the infinite of nature. They transcend the finitude of a mortal life and start to dance with the infinite. So this is where this model of human character, answers the question of free will and determinism, or individuality versus being a symptom. All the complexity of this comes from the fact that you can collaborate in rewriting your own character. Not rewriting, but at least cultivating, like a gardener cultivates. You can't make it do things that are outside of its capacity to do, but you can help it do more of the healthy things and less of the unhealthy things. And those changes over time will change what it can be cultivated into doing the next time, right? The frame changes each time as you go through this cycle of self-cultivation. So, yeah, war games comes to mind, AI comes to mind. We all get nervous when we start thinking about programs deciding for themselves what they should do, but that's what we do. That's what this cat on my lap does. That's what a tree does. There's parts of their programming they can't mess with, but there's parts of their programming they can. And over time, they grow into different shapes and start becoming capable of doing different things. And it's part of the glory and terror of life that we are partially in control and partially out of control. It's the human condition. I'm going to do, I think Phil went most recently. So even though he's had his hand up longer, I'm going to do Stephen and then Phil. So Phil, remember what you were going to say. Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, Ram was bringing up the question of objective truth and subjective truth, object and subject. And this seems to be lost on a lot of people who think they're philosophers today. The very, very simple Kitty's book illustration of objective and subjective thought is, you see a horse in a paddock. I have a mental picture of a horse, which is the concept. Okay. I can go up to somebody else and say, you see that horse? And we might even have slightly different mental pictures. And we can go up and we can actually check where our mental picture is off. Now, the classic illustration is you have the horse and that's a concrete thought. This is a kiddie book's illustration. You can't take it too hard, but it serves a purpose because it's simple. And you can abstract that image. This is what we can, particularly as humans, we can do. We can take that image we have of reality and change it in the fantasy. So we can abstract the horn of a narwhal, that whale-like creature, stick it on the horse in our imagination, and that is simply defined as the abstract thought. But I can't go up to other people and say, oh, do you see that unicorn over there? But you can end up in a science fiction fandom where we're all drawing unicorns, and I can say my unicorn is prettier than your unicorn. And there is a subjective appreciation, and it's like, you know, truth, justice, and the American way are abstractions. Now, this is part of the problem. When the atheists say to me, you can't show me a concrete example of God. And I'll say, so what? You atheists are full of abstractions which aren't found in reality. I can't find truth, justice, and the American way in a cage in the zoo. I can't find a truly objective example of that. We're stuck with the subjective being. I'm just raising this issue that this is something that needs to be paid attention to, and it just seems so many people are lost on a thing that used to be discussed so greatly in amongst, say, the idealistic philosophers, and that the difference between objective reality and subjective reality. Positive science suddenly said, put down the poles and said, we'll just stick with the objective. We'll stick with what can be demonstrated. What can't be demonstrated will be damned to hell, like it doesn't exist. This is where we are now, and I think it's getting worse.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, the subjective-objective distinction is an example of one of those distinctions moderns love, right? There's 2 points. One point is subjective and one point is objective, and everything must be one or the other. And this is how we think as moderns, where the law of the excluded middle, we want to divide things into little cartoons. But in truth, you know, there is a real world. This is the ancient perspective. There is a real world of nature out there. You could say that it's objective. But when we start talking about perspectives and ideas, it all starts to melt apart. Because we could say, on the one hand, the person who engages in begriff, who's just talking about their feelings and sensations, maybe they're more subjective, right? Because they're talking about how they feel. And maybe the person who's talking about the facts, how much does that horse weigh? How tall is it? You know, what is the wavelength of color that it is? We could say, well, that's more objective. But in truth, these are 2 different modes of subjectivity. Neither of them is the horse. The horse is the objective reality. The thing over there before we ever looked at it, and that it'll be after we leave, that's objectively true. But whether we are engaging in characterizing it through our impressions of it and our experience of it, or whether we are engaging with it abstractly as a bunch of data points and theories, in both cases, we are at the mercy of the strengths and weaknesses of the mental faculties we're using. So what we actually have, says Hegel, where Kenneth Smith is drawing this from, is 2 different modes of subjectivity, one of which claims to be more objective, right? Noesis claims to be more objective. But in doing so, it's lying to itself about itself and how it works. If I create a database of horses, and in my database, you know, I capture the mass and the height and the color and all these other, and the age and all these other facts, that database is not more real than walking up and touching the horse. The experience of being with a horse has a whole bunch of reality to it that's missing from my spreadsheet. And vice versa, right? I may not have a sense of how much this horse weighs. I might be a little kid and think I can pick the horse up. That's, even though I feel that I can do that, it doesn't make it objectively true. So each of them is seeing part of the picture that the other one is missing. And of course, the critique of human consciousness is there's also an enormous amount about the horse that neither of these mental faculties is capable of understanding or thinking about, which is we're finite individuals with finite minds who can only understand so much. It gets more complicated when you start to say, okay, so if these 2 faculties are both subjective, then this is an unreliable area. It's like, yeah, but that's our access to the truth. That's what we have. And so our attempt to understand objective truth has to be translated through these various subjective modes. This is what Hegel's writing about in the philosophy of Geist. He's talking about the real challenge of the human condition is that you never have anything that's purely subjective or purely objective. When we try to understand objective truth, it has to be translated through various forms of subjectivity that are mutually exclusive and antagonistic to each other. And we have to somehow try to triangulate and put together an impression or a model. This is where science, and I'm looking at Sharon thinking about medicine. This is where science comes into play. Is can we come up with the right triangulations on the objective truth through all these subjective filters that we can actually do something useful in the world? Treat the horse and help it be healthy, for example. It's quite an art to harness these different things together. Thus the dialectics of the objective and the subjective. It's complex. I was just thinking about consciousness and unconsciousness, and how a typical claim of noesis is that because it's conscious, it's more objective and therefore more important and more good and more real. But, what is it that makes it possible for us to think? Well, to start with, we have 37 trillion cells, more or less, and every one of those suckers is busy. And they're not busy doing a single thing at a time. If you zoom in on a single cell, it's got thousands or millions of activities happening at exactly the same time within the cell. That's before you start adding the second cell, right? Now, the human mind can keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 things, and we look at this cell doing, thousands or millions of things, in it at the same time in a moment, and you say, I can't even summarize what that cell is doing. Now multiply that by 37 trillion and the interactions between them. And what we end up with is, if we could become fully conscious, if nothing happened within us that was not our conscious choice, we'd die very quickly. The reason we die very quickly is, you see this grape? If I can't eat and digest this grape, I only have maybe a few weeks to live. If my body can't process water, I only have a few days to live. If my body can't process oxygen, I only have a few minutes to live. But my conscious mind literally does not know how to do any of those 3 things, right? If it was up to me to digest this grape, I would be an abject failure. The vast part of the iceberg that's underwater that these 37 trillion cells and their combinations account for is what lets me eat and digest a grape, or drink water, or take a breath. So this is the thing that noesis can't stand, because noesis has fought so hard to extricate itself from gnosis, right? To say, I will be conscious. I will consciously choose my life. I will plan and design my life. I will decide it. It comes with an unhealthy boatload of contempt for the begriff part of ourselves. But the begriff experiential part of ourselves is what makes it possible to live at all. And it does an enormous amount of work. Most of the work done within our body at any given instant is being done by the unconscious parts of our body. And only because they're busy all the time doing all those things is it possible for us to have a consciousness at all. So the proper relationship between the two is the consciousness needs to understand its dependency upon the unconsciousness, that it is both a willfulness and ability to choose and plan and so forth, and a pathos in that it is dependent upon all these things that it not only does not, but must not control for fear that it would wreck it all. This is the human condition. I saw Rama wanted to say something. Go ahead, Rama.
So one of the things that I think about a lot when I'm thinking about truth is it can be subjective or objective, but there is also another property of truth, whether it is useful or whether it is relevant or not. So when we talk about the unconscious, sure, we can agree that we will never be able to know the entire body detail of everything. However, for the pertinent question that we are trying to answer, whatever question we have, is it relevant? How would we know whether it's relevant or not?
Yeah, that's a challenge, isn't it? Right? It's the selection of what we attend to is what determines. I mean, it's done on the basis of what our character thinks is relevant. This is the realm of the daimon, according to this chapter, from the ancient perspective, that our character, even before our conscious mind is engaged, our character has already blurred out and pushed into the background most of reality and picked out the things that it's interested in, that it's going to attend to. And it does that on the basis of what it thinks is relevant, or what it imagines is relevant, or what it feels or is naturally predisposed to assume is relevant. And through experience, the character learns to pay more attention to some things and less to others. There's an intensive learning cycle, right, that's involved in this, but it's not a perfect cycle. It's more a cycle of iterative approximation. And as we know from life, this selection process is fraught with error. It's wonderful how often it gets it right, that we're able to live as long as we can, but it also gets it wrong so often, at least partly. So we find ourselves in sort of imperfect conditions. There's this Achilles heel in the scientific method that a number of people have written about, including Paul Feyerabend, the philosopher, and Kenneth Smith has written about it too. It's called ceteris paribus. The basis of any scientific model is this model is true if all else is equal. If there's no outside interference, then E equals mc squared, right? Whether you're talking Boyle's law, whether you're talking about the law of a current moving through a wire, turbulence in a pipe, all of these models and theories we have are only true if all else is equal. Because, I mean, you're talking about inflation of a balloon, someone comes along with a needle and pops it, the balloon isn't going to inflate according to your predictions anymore. Things are coming out as fast as they're going in. So ceteris paribus, all else being equal is the foundation of every one of these scientific models. The problem is, all else being equal requires that you know all else. And the volume of information and facts contained in all else is infinite. And our little pointy human Homo sapien minds only have room for a small finite number of things. We are in no position to evaluate whether all else is equal, right? It's the Achilles heel of science. And it's part of why science's solution to this Achilles heel is iterative approximation, right? We recognize in advance that our models are going to be incomplete and imperfect, because who are we to say ceteris paribus? There's an amazing act of willfulness involved in saying this is true if all else is equal. And then, over time, we learn through experimentation and experience whether or not we have ignored something we better take into account. And then we have to modify our models. So there is this give and take and push and pull in this. Phil and then Geneva. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I guess what I want to question is whether the dialectic really is a reflection of a organic model, or whether it's partially a reflection of that, but it's actually still more sophisticated mechanical model. And that's the difference between a positive dialectic, the dialectic itself is a negation, or negative dialectics. Because in the organic model, the negative reflection on the flower is not that, no, that's not a flower that you see. It's not saying that. I'm negating the flower. It's that the flower has to be negated in order for the acorn to appear, right? The acorn has to be negated in order for the sapling to appear. The sapling becomes the oak. So there's a cyclical relationship that adapts to a kind of like the environment by the way of externalities. And so that actually is a positive, because it continue, I guess is what figure in transformation, from one thing transforming into another thing. You could call it the transmigration of souls, I suppose. But the negative connotation would be, and my thought is this, the dialectic is this, Hegel says, the hour nerva is when flight takes off, okay? Which reminds me of like the saying, "It's always darkest before the dawn," right? But there's another saying, "It's always darkest before it gets black." Okay, and so I'm always wondering whether when I'm standing on the edge of the precipice, the cliff, whether the dawn is arriving or whether the black will happen.
Yes. Yes.
So this is the problem that I have with the dialectic itself, right? Like it still doesn't settle. Is it the positive dialectic that the dawn will indeed arise? Or is it like this is the last dialectic
Yeah.
and things are gonna get black all over? And you know, maybe I should start making black paintings. You know?
You could, you know, I've been fascinated by the study in the last few decades where they're able to use advanced techniques to look under the surface of the paint to see what was painted there before. It's really interesting. You could have a whole thing as an artist where you paint these amazing paintings and then cover it all over with black.
Well,
and you're like, the painting is in there.
Actually,
It is.
I did something that was very similar to that, but I want to refer to what's his name? I forgot his name, but dang, I should know his name. But he painted these paintings. Is imagine a square surface canvas that divided into essentially a tic-tac-toe square, right? So there's the 9 squares.
Yeah.
And what he painted was these painting that looks like it's kind of gray, but I mean a dark gray, but they're very, very subtly colored. And so what he was saying, in a sense, is he was still painting representations, referencing something. If he go any further than that, it would become a black painting. Right? I mean, like he's sort of like, it's sort of like the most minimal you could get without being absolutely minimal, right? And exactly what I remember seeing this at, I think at the Museum of Modern Art. I don't think it was at the Whitney. What I did is I went to the next room. I actually spent a half an hour staring at that painting because it was kind of like almost nothing, but there was something.
Yeah.
And then I went next door and saw oh God, I keep forgetting these guys' names now. But this guy who actually painted the next generation painting, which is sort of what's minimal paintings, in which there was no more representation. It was just really like stripes of black lines, but it was sort of so mechanical and physical that it only asserted itself. And this is what Frank Stella, Frank Stella's name, once was asked, you know, what does your painting represent? He says, it is what it is. You know, that's it. It's an object in the world.
Yeah.
It no longer reference symbols, signs, anything, representation. It is just the thing itself.
Yeah.
And I think there is kind of a struggle between in the world, how much is the thing in itself the thing, and how much the thing itself also has a reference to other things, you know? So that's very interesting. And I think we have become an increasingly objectified world.
Yeah.
In which things are what they are, you know? So I'll just say that step, which is sort of like a very small step, completely transformed. Now I guess you could argue that Frank Stella was really, Ed Reinhardt was the other guy, was painting the flower. Now I'm painting the acorn.
Yeah.
It is what it is. Okay, so I don't know how you take that relationship, but in some sense, that was very, very interesting. What happened there? So it's always darkest before it gets black.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's part of the nature of the dialectics of history that Hegel describes, that you could think of the first third of a new epoch as being this age of incredible philosophical ferment, when they're writing down all of their core ideas and how they're in opposition to the previous epoch and why this is an important revolution, the bold new ideas. And then somewhere around the middle third, they're getting complacent because they're sort of everything's, the cylinders are all firing, they're in charge, everything, they seem to be at the peak of their powers. In other words, their worldview seems to be working. It seems satisfactory. There's the least possible reason to question the worldview and the most reason to use it, to exercise it, to do the work of life. But in the final third, as it starts to unravel, increasingly, it gets harder and harder for people to ignore the disconnect between what the model said should happen and what's actually happening in the world around us. We see that now with, our marketplace is supposed to provide for our needs in the most efficient way possible. And yet I'm here in Seattle with one of the highest rates of homelessness in the country. It's like literally 2 of my brothers are homeless. It's like, it's everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's people who don't have a home. And that's not supposed to happen. According to the classical theory, the purpose of an economy is to meet people's needs in some efficient way, and capitalism claims to be the most efficient. It's only later that capitalism starts to embrace this idea of, well, we never really promised everybody was going to be happy. Only the winners are going to be happy. This is a stage shift that you see happening to try to rationalize the discontinuities of the late stage economy. So what happens is, as we see more and more pressing and urgent discontinuities between what's predicted and what happens, it compels people to ask questions they never asked during the complacency of the middle period. And they're a different kind of question than they asked during the first philosophical phase. During the first philosophical phase, they were critiquing the old system, right? They were justifying themselves in terms of the old worldview. But that's, by the third phase, that's all gone now. Nobody can blame the old previous epoch anymore because it hasn't been in charge for ages. So now we have to ask different questions, which is, what's wrong with our worldview? This is why the Owl of Minerva takes flight with the fall of night. This is, as things begin to unravel, that it's proven to us that our perfect little system isn't so perfect anymore. And now we have to start to ask why. Where are the differences? Why doesn't this explain everything? And we didn't feel the need to ask those questions in the previous 2/3 of our epoch. There was no reason to. So anyway, Geneva, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, I had one question, and now that I've heard all of this, I've got 3 others. But of course, every time I hear Hegel, I get excited. So yeah, I love Hegel. But my question goes back a couple. And talking of Hegel, what you were just saying, I think like we didn't know the questions to ask, and I think that Hegel would say that's part of the evolution. Like we see where our last thrust got us to, and so now something else has to be born. Other things need to come into play, and something will come of that. I think that's what he would say, because like Phil was talking about, the flower has to negate itself in order to become the acorn. And I think that's kind of what is going on in what you were just talking about. But
Right.
What I wanted to ask about, and this goes back a ways, you were talking about as to the horse, like the color, the weight, the size, those sorts of things. And I was wondering if that is the same idea as Plato's theory of forms, or if that is connected in any way, because that's kind of how I was seeing it. Like there's the forms, and then there's the thing, and the real world and the thought world, or something like that. And I was just wondering, is that sort of the same or different? Or I mean, and then you talked about the palimpsest of painting, like I was like, oh my God, that's like a palimpsest, only it's painting, not writing. So like all these things have come up, but that was my primary question, is that theory of forms.
Sure. Yeah, you can see how it is that we could only get through a paragraph in a day. because
Yeah,
Kenneth is
absolutely,
constantly
yeah.
pointing to all this stuff, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's thought-provoking stuff, and it's the combinations, the unexpected combinations, saying, you know, have you ever thought about the way that when Descartes said this, it actually, what happens if you put that together with when Kafka wrote this story, and you go, what? Why would you put those together? And then you look at them and go, ooh, yeah, what does
Yeah.
that mean? That's sort of what happens in these conversations, is sort of an extrapolation of what Kenneth's already doing. You know, the thing about the theory of forms with Plato is, the short, and Donald's here and he's a Plato expert. So, you know, I notice he's looking up to hear how I'm going to butcher Plato.
Oh.
So he can raise his hand. But before I go forward, I have to say, Donald, don't forget what you were going to say when you had your hand raised, because I'm going to call on you and ask you what it was before you get a chance to defend Plato from my atrocities here. So, you know, the shorthand version of the theory of forms has to do with, it was an attempt by Plato to reconcile, I think Donald might or might not agree, Parmenides with Heraclitus. That Parmenides is saying nothing changes, Heraclitus is saying everything changes, and Plato's saying, well, come on, guys. I mean, it can't be both of them. It can't be only one of them. So how do we put this together to explain the world as we see it? And he comes up with this idea that what if there are these kind of, like, as in mathematics, if you think about the number 2 and you say 2 apples, you're saying abstractly that you have 2 of the same thing. But if you go out and collect any 2 actual apples, you can't find 2 that are exactly the same. Something about the 2 will be different. They're each individuals. So there is a certain way in which there is an idealized form of 2 apples, and then there are all these specific forms we're able to create whenever we pick up any pair of apples and put them side by side and say, here is my 2 apples. And so he said one way to think about this is that there is sort of this abstract ideal world of forms from which reality offers variations. And you could call them imperfections, or you could call them realizations, or you could have a number of different kinds of value systems about it. But at least it gives us a way to explain the difference between the abstraction and the concrete things that we find in the world. Now, all kinds of later writers, Neoplatonists, went back and added their own glosses and interpretations onto this. And since Neoplatonism was one of the important ingredients that went into Orthodox medieval religion, there is a whole lot of value judgment associated with which of these is the real one, right? So the medieval position is that the ideal forms are the real thing, and that the actual 2 apples are the fallen, imperfect dross that fails to live up to the perfection of God's ideas for the universe. You know, there's this value judgment that's being used as an epistemology to explain why you should do what the church tells you, or you're going to go to hell. There's this whole construct where everything is like fraught with peril, and it's hard for moderns who define themselves as having overthrown the medieval world to read Plato without injecting those medievalisms into our interpretation of Plato. We're inclined to add those later value judgments into what Plato wrote. That's part of why it's so interesting to actually read Plato himself, is that, you know, when he speaks in his own language, which he's very fluent at doing, we get his description without all the later, I guess, concretions that are weighing it down in our understanding of it. Ernst Cassirer, who's a 20th century philosopher, wrote some very interesting short books about, he was a Neoplatonist, but a Neoplatonist, a modern Neoplatonist. And he wrote some interesting interpretations where one of the conclusions he reached is that there is no actual ideal world of forms existing anywhere, that that's not how he reads Plato. How he reads Plato is that that's the structure of human consciousness. That in our minds, we create a bunch of ideals and we map those onto reality. As whenever we see a pair of apples, our brain equates that with the abstract pair of apples in our mind. And that therefore you can use Plato's theory of forms to do a real interesting deep dive into the structure of consciousness and thinking, which, as far as I know, I haven't heard any other Platonist or Neoplatonist who took that approach to Plato's theory of forms. So I guess where I'm trying to go is, I think that it's a very creative, productive model that you can draw a lot of different conclusions from.
Could
Depending
I have
on
a link on this guy?
Ernst Cassirer. Yeah, I'll put a link in there. So I think so I can't give you a single answer because I think there's a lot to it, and Plato meant for there to be a lot to it. Is I guess where I'm trying to go.
Could I say something about that? Because yesterday I was in the Makusa discussion about dialectics, and that question came up. And somebody mentioned that maybe it's the same guy, but I don't think so. That it was the distortions of the Neoplatonists that transform the forms into an ideal that's real. And that Plato never intended that. It was, now this is my terms, it was sort of an aspiration. You know, I call it the push-pull, because there was a divided line and the form was on the other side of the divided line. For sure it was, okay? And it was the mind's push toward the forms, which in some sense, I guess, responded in pulling as well. There was a push-pull relationship, which means the forms were in some sense, according to Plato, that interpretation at least, is that it was an aspiration that was in some sense being pulled forward by the aspiration itself. So the push developed into a pull. And so in that sense, you could see how the pull became the whole thing about the memories. There was always the forms that was there. It's just a matter of clearing things up and it will pull you to the form. So I thought that was a very interesting explanation, because I always thought that Plato's forms were an aspiration rather than a reality, and that it was in the process of developing in this push-pull relationship, right? And so that's why it's beyond the divided line. You know, it's like he could have put a ray on the divide. By the way, I believe he thinks that mathematics is on this side of the divided line. So that was the push, and the pull was, oh, it was always there in the mind, you know, from the past. So there's a funny relationship between the past and the present as well. It's just simply a matter of clearing off the dust, and you're going to get to what was there to begin with. But that was always kind of imaginary.
Right.
So that's my addition to it.
Thanks, Bill.
According to a discussion, this actually was not what Makusa talked about, but it was something that arose from the discussion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, the best discussions are. I'm accepting as a virtue what might be a vice, which is the best discussions are always far wide ranging. Because after all, I can't seem to hold these any other way, so I might as well enjoy it and say, we meant to do that.
We're in aporia.
Yeah. So Donald, tell us what was on your mind before we started going into Plato.
Well, that Phil is somehow the dialectical Malevich who's going to produce black on black here anytime as a new painting. Then I looked at some of Malevich's other things, and he's already done some black things, so maybe he was his own dialectic. But Phil, if you went to the Museum of Modern Art, you would have seen it's upstairs. It's right behind some door. Malevich is white on white, which is not really that interesting, although it's interesting in philosophy of art classes, I think. But about Plato, there is on whatever this, what do we call it? What's this service we use here that has all these forms? There is some, huh? Oh, Meetup. Yeah. There is a Plato's Pod with a guy named James that does it. I used to attend that one. And if you are interested in a medieval view of Plato, where Plato and Thomas Aquinas are the same, and Plato is somewhat the foundation of the true Catholic Church and the true belief, you can go there. I mean, I would suggest you won't learn a thing about Plato, not even, but there's certainly lots of people that read Plato that way.
Right.
About to what Rick said about the only thing I would add, I mean, it's how do we account for sameness? Heraclitus says everything is flux. Well, if everything is flux, then everything is radical different in every instant in time. So even things like what Heraclitus says, you never step twice into the same river. Well, who doesn't? What's the same? What's river? What's, you know, the idea of any coherence. So it's how do we account for sameness in the midst of flux? And I think Phil's right. Mathematics is an example, but it's not the ideas. It's not, and I'm not sure that the ideas are really ideals. That sort of slides from one. That seems like that's something that happens in English, not in Plato. But the other thing is that things that are seem to also participate in multiple ideas. Things both have color and have shape and can be just or unjust or whatever. So there's a real complexity going on that I don't know where you would go to straighten it out, but I think you can understand Socrates and his ethical and moral concerns without ever even considering Plato's theory of ideas. And I might even recommend that until you've sort of gotten past that part. Some of these other issues are not as interesting, and maybe they're not even solved. But you know, like, but there's, I don't know. That's enough about that, I think. You know, I would say that, like, there's a big difference. I've been trashed all my adult life by Kenneth for studying Plato. But even in the Republic, Plato makes clear if nature doesn't deliver up someone capable of ruling, you're not ever going to have a just republic, a just polis.
Right.
So in many ways, in spite of this being an idealist, which I don't believe, Plato is in many ways as existential as any philosopher.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
that just gets completely overlooked in almost all readings of Plato. They're very few. So read Plato at your own peril.
Well, another way to say what you're saying is it's you know, if we read Plato initially from a naive modern perspective, we get something 100% different from what Plato intended, because Plato wasn't a modern. He didn't mean by these words that he wrote the things that we would mean if we wrote them, right? It's the only way to really fully grok Plato is to come at him from an ancient perspective and say, what do the ancients all take for granted as the things that we all agree on? And then you can see where he's trying to make distinctions. And if you do that, as Donald's saying, many of his core philosophies that we think we understand read very differently. He could be a naturalist, for example, because all ancients were. It's like, but you take Plato's work out of its proper context and you read it like a medieval or a modern, and what we're seeing is not what he meant at all.
It was quite popular when I was young to sort of translate the syllogisms within the dialogues into some sort of symbolic text, and then point out where the logic had gone astray. Usually the logic went astray in whoever was writing this paper and producing these syllogisms. There are other things. I would say read Thucydides, understand the Peloponnesian War, at least. And I would say, you can go get the annotated Thucydides or something that's got lots of maps. It's got lots of annotations that identifies who the people are and what they were doing. Because, and also you can read Xenophon, who has sort of he's an aristocrat, but he's not as philosophically subtle. So you get a totally different view of Socrates, where you kind of miss the philosophical subtlety, but you still see the same guy. It's clearly the same character. The other is I have a book. Strangely, my department chair tried me to write this book when I was young, but I found some other lady that went to LSU wrote this book where she goes through every dialogue of Plato and collects all the historical information about every character that appears in the dialogue, and almost all of them are historical characters. And I think you must understand some of that. I mean, that's what I did, was for things like example, in the Laches, there's a general appears, Nicias, and they're talking about who can predict the future of a battle best, the general or the soothsayer. And because soothsayer they knows the future, and Nicias kind of says, I see the appeal of the soothsayer, but it's really got to be the general, because the general knows the arts of war. Well, it just so happens that Nicias was the general that led the expedition to Syracuse. And when faced with, should the army retreat because they were in a bad way, or should they stay, Nicias went and asked his soothsayer. And the soothsayer said, things are really bad here. We've got a eclipse of the moon or a new moon or whatever. So we're going to have to stay here another lunar month. And during that month, all 30,000 of the Athenians were killed by the Syracusans. So if you know the Peloponnesian War and Nicias's role in it, you read the dialogue, the Laches, one way. If you don't and just think it's just an anonymous name stuck there, which it's not, because Socrates is clearly having a go at him for his character.
Right.
It's because for Socrates, strangely, character is fate. Character is the man. That's how you judge whether to put stock in what he says or not. And it turns out, like in the Meno, which everybody reads, and everybody's concerned, about how they come up with the square root of 2 on the diagonal to produce the square that's twice the size, and it's, oh, how mathematical. In there are two other characters, Meno, who was a captain on Xenophon's march up country, who got a bunch of people killed because he was a jerk and didn't know diddly squat, and Anytus, who testified, was one of the people who brought the charges at Socrates' trial, who appears in the Apology. And if you don't track all this stuff down, I don't know how you can read Plato, because he's trying to tell you who were the people in that last 30 years of the 5th century,
right,
who wrecked Athens. And the same, Critias, who led the 30, he's got a whole dialogue He's in the Charmides. He's Charmides' uncle, and Charmides was one of the 30. All of these people are real people, lots of them nefarious people who did a great deal of harm. And he wants to show you by asking them questions, questioning them to get them to reveal themselves. And I guarantee you, any Athenian who read Plato in the 4th century would have known who these people were. This is like if you read a dialogue today or a story today, and Bill Clinton stood up, and if Bill Clinton appears in there and he said, and they ask him some question and he says, I did not have sex with that woman, Monica Lewinsky. People who knew the real history would just go, or about Richard Nixon saying, I am not a crook.
Right.
You would know, oh, this guy,
He's a crook.
he's a crook. Was a liar,
Yes.
What I mean, and that's the way it would be, but we don't think of it that way. We think of it.
He remains your greatest president ever.
Well,
Nixon.
I'm not arguing politics. I'm arguing
References.
character here, references and character. I mean, there are things like that we would recognize in our own fiction if these characters appeared.
Yeah.
And acted out of what we know their real character to be.
Right.
So
Right.
So I think that's enough about Plato. You don't have to read him. If you do read him carefully.
And get a really good annotated volume. Lots of annotations. Who are these people?
Who are these people? That's right. I think I think Dr. Bigger, who was our chairman, must have convinced some other student. In fact, every student that came through that department, he gave them a fellowship to kind of go look into Plato. Take 5x7 cards. Go to the basement of the library. They had there the Pauli Vasova Real Encyclopädie der Klassischen Altertumswissenschaft, which had all the references to everything in antiquity in it. All you had to do was read what they wrote in German, and then all the stuff they cited was in Greek. So it was well hidden. It was well hidden.
Ah, well.
Good day.
I mean, what you're describing is essentially what this book, Millennia and Microcosm, is about, right? It's saying that you can't just naively pick up a text from some random epoch and read it and understand it. You have to know the context. How did people see the world? Who were these people? What did they want? What did they notice or not notice? And when you know those things, it completely changes the reading, right? You read, this general who was responsible for the destruction of 30,000 Athenians invading Syracuse, making his protestations in Plato's, dialogue. If you don't know who he is, you don't know that you're supposed to be laughing out loud when he says, "Oh yes, I totally believe this." You're like, you so don't believe that. We know from your behavior you don't believe that. It's like, so it helps, to get a good annotated volume, and it helps to learn this context, because now you're reading something completely different. And of course, ultimately, this whole seminar that we're doing is an exercise in reading Kenneth exactly that way. What is Kenneth referring to? Who are these other philosophers? Why did he use this? This is what we're trying to do, is create the annotated Kenneth Smiths.
Well, and Kenneth kind of shows this in the way he's gone through Heraclitus. And if not retranslated, certainly reinterpreted Heraclitus. I used to keep like G.S. Kirk's authoritative work, huge, on Heraclitus, and go through that. And you would have found absolutely nothing of philosophical interest on Heraclitus. All you found is constant discussions of Greek grammar, Greek stuff, trying to philologically answer the question. not philosophically.
Yes. We'll wrap up with Stephen's comment. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, in this question I've been pursuing, I've got all my little points still on the boiler there. On the agenda, we've still got Gleitner, the definition and practice of rationalism by Kenneth Smith, the new book that's coming out, and subject versus object as one of the chapters.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I went through this process in my 30s when I was trying to study philosophy, and I really know nothing about the ancient Greeks, Plato, Socrates. Only now am I starting to come across them. And I realised in my definition of rationalism, I went through the phases of Greek philosophy. And that is, we go from objective nature as the subject to making our own minds and our own abstract ideas a subject. So somehow it would have always been there, even in ancient Egypt, but mainly the mankind before that was concerned with objective reality. And subjective reality belonged to the realm of the gods, spirit, but Greek philosophy changed that. And I think we have a very serious problem in education now that you'd have to almost say that any person that wants to be a university graduate would have to have some grounding from the pre-Socratic to the post-Socratic philosophers. And even then we get on to the Neoplatonists who discovered the problem. We cannot overcome skepticism unless there's some all-powerful being in the universe who is our friend. Because we humans are subject to so much. We cannot solve the universal problems. We need an all-powerful entity on our side. This was the conclusion to even overcome nihilism, to overcome their nihilism, which was skepticism. There has to be a big daddy up there that's going to pat me at the end of the day and say, there, little boy, don't worry, Big Daddy is here to make everything okay. But yeah, that's my point. It's a tragedy today that possibly these Greek studies are being thrown out of courses.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot be an intelligent person in the modern age without giving due credence to that whole passage of the previous Western civilization, which screwed up and crashed and burned and went into the darkness for 1,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And on that note, we'll wrap up. I was overly optimistic, as I am every single week, about how far we would get through, but it's because we have unpacked so much information out of the paragraph we went through. So typical par for the course. We'll pick up with paragraph 5 of section E next week.
Thanks a
Rick.
lot, everybody.
Thanks, David. Thanks, guys. See you next week.